Hello, welcome to Boundless and Bottomless Threes, episode 2. Although, kind of episode 3, me and numbering schemas never really work. Um, so we are in the middle of chapter 1 of For Political Theory, the 2012 Arktos Publishing edition. Although occasionally, if there's divergences in translation, I will be referring to the independently published fourth position or uh, for fourth fourth positionist theory press edition by Mark Sleboda. Um, so far, I found the Arktos to be much more readable, and I can't really maybe if I was fluent in Russian and could check out the original, I could make a sense if the readability was actually a better translation or it's just being a more readable translation. But we're gonna have to go off of more readable for now. For those
Yeah,
of you,
translating Russian seems to be a very complicated project because my favorite poem by Mikhail Lermontov, I know of at least 6 translations and 5 of them are bad. They say an entirely different thing than the one that I like, which is probably the least popular. So
yeah, Russian seems to be one of those languages that, even though it is, at least on like say Chinese, where I'm always like, I don't know, man, can someone who speaks Chinese tell me if this is remotely related to the way it's being translated? Um, I feel like it is clearly an Indo-European language, but like its structures and whatnot in its discourse patterns seem markedly different from English.
yeah,
And I'm not familiar with them. So
I mean the simplest example of that is that like when a person who speaks Russian, they move to the States and they speak English as a second language, they never say like very like crucial things that are like really common to us. Like they'll say something like, "You give keys," and in Russian, literally translated, that sentence is perfect and even poetic. But in English, it's almost impossible to understand.
English is weird. This is a language digression, but English is weird because it actually, more than most other Indo-European languages, even most other Germanic languages, although Germanic languages are particularly bad about this, needs a ton of linking verbs and prepositions and
Right.
articles to be cogent. And we're really flexible about what we do with those prepositions and articles and stuff, but we need them. In other languages, you don't. Like, it took
Yeah,
me
exactly.
forever. I used to, I speak some Korean, and one of the biggest things to deal with in Korean is like there's no articles. There's no way to do a definite versus indefinite thing. You just have a thing. Like there's
Yeah, you just pick it up in context,
right,
which
yeah.
is very clear if you're surrounded by Koreans and this is the only language that people speak. But if it's a second language, you know, good luck.
Yeah. So I don't know if some of this is that, because I was thinking about the problem of hypostatization or reification in this, where there's liberalism does, liberalism does, liberalism does, and I'm like, well, this could be a logical error or this could be a language problem, and I'm not sure which one. And maybe
Well, it could be both, depending on if it says if you see liberalism does a few times on one page, sometimes it could be a problem in translation, but sometimes it actually might be, something you would take an issue with, but
right.
there's no way to know.
And for and the reason why I'm really attuned to this is I've been thinking about like problems in translating linen,
Right.
um which I'm much more familiar with. I'm not familiar with the Russian, but I know all the translation debates about like highest versus latest versus most recent versus most severe, like it,
Well,
these
yeah,
part.
Lars Lee he's
Mhm.
done a lot on exactly this exact problem, like the use of the word konspiratia,
Mhm.
which is translated to conspiratorial, and it just means like underground. And so like that's a minor difference, but without the context, Lenin seems to be advocating for something that is entirely unrelated to what we're trying to do with the workers' movement. But he's really just talking about, whatever, just the conditions of repression, things like that just don't, if you don't know the context, you can make an entirely different politics of, Leninism or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And this is also true for Marx in German, except Germans are closer related. Like even in a German, which is, arguably German and French are the two most related languages to English other than like Frisian.
Right. Yeah.
I mean Frisian, excuse me. Uh yet there's tons of these problems in German, and in German I can check them and kind of make heads or tails of it. So if there's anyone who's a Russian speaker who's read Dugin in Russian, which, apparently isn't, depending on who you ask, either very common or not common at all. If something's weird, feel free to give us a heads up on what the Russian may say. I guess
Yeah, definitely.
this is a long-winded way into that. So I think we got to the end of liberalism and the arrival of post-liberalism section, which would be around page, I don't know, 11. Jesus.
Well, if you have the hard copy, it's page 19 is when it's over. That section
okay.
is yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay. So we got through partly fourth political theory as a resistance to the status quo. I know we got through that. And fourth political theory is a dissent against post-liberalism as a universal practice. And remember, by post-liberalism, he means liberalism as reduced down to the managerial apparatus of maintaining atomized individualism in a global marketplace. Like he thinks that like the rest of liberalism has pretty much been discarded down to just that essential feature. So that's what
in the next
means
chapter he makes that a little bit more explicit, but it's just worth saying now. But
yeah, I think it's important because when people are like, oh, what does he mean about post-liberalism? I think he thinks that liberalism has become anti-liberal, but because it's been reduced down. The way in which like we don't talk about postmodernity anymore in literary and or historiographic studies as much because it's a problemized term. But the reason why it's a problemized term is if we go to try to figure out anything that makes postmodernism unique, you find it all at different periods of modernism are immediately right. And by modernism, we also like modernism as a term that's also problematic because it means basically in history, everything past the 16th century. So from the quote, the beginnings of the Enlightenment, or maybe even the quote Renaissance, which we sometimes call the early modern period, to like now, which effectively makes the term meaningless.
This is a pretty good example of the Owl of Minerva not exactly taking flight just yet.
Yeah. I mean, I get why. I mean, from the standpoint of Europe, once you hit the Enlightenment, you have some key ideas that do not exist before. Not just market, not just race, although both of those kind of exist by that time, but also like secularity as opposed to religiosity. There's no distinction of that in the medieval mind. The breakdown of fields of knowledge, instead of like just wisdom and technique. And there was other schemas in the ancient world and in the medieval world, but not the one that we have. So in that sense, it makes sense to start at about the 15th century, but in other ways, it's like very vague. And what I've noticed, the current trend in Western historiography, even in some friends of the show, is to just deny that these periodizations have any meaning whatsoever. And that like we can talk about like the medieval period the same way we can talk about now, which I think
is unhelpful. It's ahistorical, and it makes studying history meaningless, really.
Yeah.
Then it's really just becomes a series of events, and the events could have been 700 years ago or 70 seconds ago. It doesn't really matter when.
And I think I will give Dugin this, that he's not doing that. So post-liberalism is a universal practice. He defines fourth political theory as a sin against this, against postmodernity. It's interesting to me how much the terminology of postmodernity has fallen off in the preceding years since this was published a little over a decade ago in English and a little over 14 years ago in Russian. Because we don't talk about postmodernity at all.
Now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, in fact, like I went to a recent intellectual history conference, and it's just like considered almost the postmodernists and people who insist on postmodern historiography are almost considered gauche and like dinosaurs. So it is interesting how far that's gone. Against the end of history, against the status quo, against the inertia of the process of civilization at the dawn of the 21st century. All right, so fourth political theory is anti-stuff. The status quo and this inertia do not presuppose any political theories whatsoever. A global world can only be ruled by the laws of economics and universality of human rights. All political decisions are replaced by technical ones. Machinery and technology substitute for all else. The French philosopher Alain de Benoit, or Deboniste, I never know, terms this la governance, or micromanagement. Managers and technocrats, blah, 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 take the place of politicians who make historic decisions. This is more of this managerial thesis, which is common on the right, going all the way back to James Burnham. I do think we need to point out that like so much of this actually has clear predecessors in right-wing and post-Marxist, both right and left theories prior to Dugin. What Dugin's doing is kind of synthesizing them in a strange way. And we made a big deal out of this about how calling Dugin a fascist is like going to be easily subverted by Dugin himself, because there's clearly ways in which he's critiquing fascism, but people go, but it's post-fascism is really still fascist. I'm like, well, I mean, that's like saying Baudrillard's still a Marxist, right? Like, only in the most loose sense would it still apply.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to be honest, I kind of think that, this is my kind of disclaimer that I'm going to check at the end of the series. But I kind of think that Dugin is way, way more insightful. I know we said this already, but a lot more insightful than he's given credit for. And I think the problem is really only this. I wrote this down, actually. Because he's trying to construct a new, a fourth political theory out of the kind of the wreckage, salvaging the wreckage of liberalism, Marxism, and fascism. But like what he's really trying to do, or what he should be trying to do, is just what Marxism is supposed to do. Because the problem with Marxism is just that like he took liberalism and just kept going, right? So it's just stopped. It basically abandoned the dialectic. So Dugin's wrong. I mean, probably a lot. He's wrong, whatever. But I think the steps that he takes, they're all necessary. It's the real tragedy is that one of our side is not the one who actually did this.
Well, I think we'll get to this when we get to the battle with his section of the battle for postmodernity. But I really want to point out that I think also like he's right about what the end of history was, and we'll get to that in a minute. And why that's bad for Marxist and fascist for a variety of reasons. But like, we will have to deal with that when we come to it. All right.
Right. Okay.
So the fourth political theory is considered as conceived as an alternative to post-liberalism, but not one as an ideological arrangement in relation to the other. This is interesting, and it's actually kind of hard to parse. Instead, it is an incorporeal idea as opposed to corporeal matter, as a possibility entering into the conflict with the actuality, as that which is yet to come into being attacked, which that was already in existence. So this is basically an explicit call for fourth political theory as kind of I would say a traditionalist, although he doesn't use that term here. A traditionalist utopianism explicitly, almost.
Right.
And that's interesting. Fourth political theory cannot be a continuation of either the second political theory or the third, so it can't be a continuation of Marxism or fascism. Although, as I pointed out last time, he he borrows from fascism a lot more judiciously and extensively than he borrows from Marxism. Like, I think the more we read that, this will become pretty clear.
I wonder how much of that just has to do with the fact that Marxism, for a person who grew up in the Soviet Union, means something a little bit different than Marxism for somebody who grew up in like Belgium or whatever.
Yeah, that's a fair, and particularly in the 90s and the odds.
Yeah.
But he talks about how Marxism and this he sounds like a couple other theories. I think of
Is there like a pretty big lag on my whenever whatever?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
The Loyal Opposition to Modernity. It's by Thurburn, Gibbon Thurburn, who saw Marxism as the way of articulating liberalism's like dialectical animate critique from the standpoint of the values of liberalism itself. And fascism, in a strange way, fascism's anti-enlightenment stuff still holds organic unities and democratic polities and a relatively not egalitarian, that's not the right word, but a relatively mass politics as a given, as a kind of critique of modernity that still kind of comes out of it. That's what, I think that's why we have such trouble with fascism. Like, everything is fascist and nothing is fascist, because everything has elements of fascism, including everything in liberalism. And yet also there does seem to be things distinct about it. Yet when you try to like find anything distinct to all fascist movements, you realize there's going to be a movement that doesn't have it. And that go ahead.
Because fascism is like it's kind of like an attempt to LARP the old world, back into existence, but on the basis of liberalism, and like it rejects. It's basically it's an attempt to kind of negate liberalism, but in liberal terms. So it's kind of a phony pre-enlightenment, old worldism. That's the reason why I think a person like Dugin kind of has to like try to find stuff about fascism that he thinks is worth saving, because what he really wants to do is go back to before liberalism and save some of that.
Right. I mean, this is, like, properly speaking, a reactionary thought. I don't think there's any way around that. When people try to deny that about Dugin, they are missing the point. Like, Dugin's ideal worldview is basically the Ruski Mir of like the Tsar before maybe Ivan the Terrible. Like, I'm
Right.
not even really joking, because I think even like going back to Peter and Catherine's going to be too infected with Western modernity for him.
Well, I mean, Peter and Catherine were very explicitly pro-Western and pro-modernity.
Right. So it's where all that French came from into Russian aristocratic language.
Right.
So, he said, I mean, I'm reading a lot. I'm skipping. He keeps on talking about oh yes. They challenged the spirit of modernity. Fascism did so almost openly, I would say openly. Communism more covertly. See the review of the Soviet period as a special eschatological version of traditional society by Mikhail S. Agassi and Sergei Kara-Murza, which who I've not read, but that sounds like the Van Koon-Linton critique, that communism was trying to imitize the eschaton, and thus was actually a return to a pre-enlightenment, almost eschatological Christian vision of the world, and that is thus heretical.
There's a certain amount of that. There's maybe like 10% of that, which I think is correct. But it's a very, it's almost insignificant amount.
Yeah,
it's a part of what communism is trying to do. But
this section is the first section where I feel like it's very clear that Dugin's Russian, because he keeps on like the references for most of what we've read. I mean, admittedly, we're only like 15 pages in, roughly, or 20 pages in, once you also consider the introduction that we went over. But like,
Right.
most of the references are, broadly speaking, Euro-American. But in this section, I'm like, okay, this post-Soviet philosopher I've never heard of, this post-Soviet historian I've never heard of, like,
Right.
Sergei Kara-Murza is a person I have heard of but not read and don't really know much about. So, I mean, I still have my same suspicion that I've had so far with reading this again, is that Dugin doesn't work out the mechanisms by which this happens. He kind of sees these as great movements of ideologies,
Yeah.
not as things which have historical material inputs. And that's an interesting thing to notice. And I think we need to like look at that more and more, because I think it's going to be more important in the second chapter, which is the Heidegger chapter.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, the second chapter kind of goes into this a little bit, but I think it's, I mean, the very simplistic way to say is that it's a very idealist understanding of history. But I think Dugin would basically, he sees the movement of, whatever, of history as being driven by being, like, by, what's the word? Dasein? Yeah.
Dasein, yeah.
And that's distinct from, production or even just like human willpower. Like, that's all, those are all parts of it. But the main thing is this other concept that, the vast majority of us have never even heard of, self included, actually.
Yeah, I've dealt with Dasein because I've spent a lot of time with being and time. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't really translate into English. I mean, it translates literally as like itness or being, but it's more like,
Isn't it like, it's like the condition of being that is specific only to humanity because of consciousness? So like, owls can be and ants can be and sharks and whatever, but Dasein is specific only to human beings. It's
yeah,
basically, it is human being, but not human being as a human comma being or whatever.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions in that. Obviously, I mean, one of the things that Heidegger doesn't get past is a humanocentric worldview. But like, one thing I would say when you get with like Dasein, because it also has implications of like the Dasein of a space is different from space to space. Like it's like the metaphor that I was taught by my professor in graduate school when I studied this was like the way in which the soil flavors the grapes of which you make wine. So the being of a German, or even of an Alsace-Lorrainian, or of is informed by the Gestalt being, which you are conscious of as a human being and alienated from because of that consciousness. But it is also unique to not just your mode of production, not just it's like your Gestalt environment. What I think is interesting about that, I've been reading a lot of David Graeber for separate stuff right now, and one of the things I found so fascinating is that Graeber and Dugin, in their approach to what they think grounds politics, they share more than they look like they share.
Huh.
And
I wonder how conscious that is, or was, or whatever.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it was speaking to something that we forget about because we live now in a post 9/11, post 2008, post revitalization of Marxism, which seems to be on its way out, frankly. I know everyone says I'm being premature on that, but I don't think so.
No, I think, I mean, 5 years ago would be premature for you to say that, but now it's not premature. It's maybe early, but it's definitely a justifiable and legitimate claim. Because I mean, I also share that exact same position.
I'm just also looking at like the last revitalizations of Marxism and like where we are in the historical timeline, and it's like we're pairing up to specific events in the 70s that were an indication of the stuff about the fall apart in the 80s and 90s. And But what's interesting to me is that makes a text like this kind of, you know, I don't think it's a mistake that a lot of people who are disillusioned with their travels out of liberalism and through Marxism into something else are falling into this as opposed to Graeber, but that this speaks to the same conditions and kind of similar presuppositions of like, well, what we believe about the world is really what determines what we can do about it. And our being needs to be, needs to come closer to that. For Graeber, that was like ethnological studies of what it meant to be communal, and that was, quote, communism, unquote. And for people who think that's late Graeber, like I found it, I've been reading Fragments of Anarchist Anthropology. It's in that's from 2004. It's like, almost a decade
well, and
before.
like the concept can be maybe fully crystallized in late Graeber, but it's peppered all throughout because he's working towards that the whole time. It's kind of like well, it doesn't really matter. I was going to make a
Go
it
ahead.
doesn't matter. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's just like how, people talk, at one point they talked a lot about the epistemological break in Marx between the early and the young Marx, between the philosophical and the economist Marx. But like traces of both can be found in both. There's an economic side in the philosophical young Marx, and there's a philosophical side in the economic mature Marx. And Capital is the most dialectical book other than I don't know why I can't think of this. Oh, other than Phenomenology of Spirit. It's just not, he just doesn't say everything that he's thinking about every single time he says anything. That's all.
Well, I mean, interestingly, I think that's why Capital doesn't get finished. But the dialectical nature, like, that he gets himself into, he can't even totally define what a prole is by the end of it. And I mean, I think that's actually, people like abandon that, or they say, oh, it's transparently. No, it is not. I think that's interesting though, that like compared us to here, to get back onto the text again. So I like it when authors give you clear footmarks. So the fourth political theory is a crusade against 1, postmodernity, 2, the post-industrial society, 3, liberal thought realized in practice, which is interesting that he doesn't say liberal thought as a whole.
Right.
And globalization, as well as its logistical and technological bases, but not capitalism. And I think that's interesting too. If the third
because
go ahead.
Liberalism and fascism, there may be one side of things and communism is the other side, but he's talking about all these things only in terms of the philosophical underpinnings. He doesn't ever talk about the underlying force of any of them. And so I just think that's really interesting, because I think it's not exactly clear what about liberalism he's trying to save, but well, I mean, it's kind of clear, but what's not clear is that he doesn't really fundamentally challenge the concept of capitalism itself, just the philosophical justifications for it.
No, like you could see him arguing that a integrated nationalistic are civilizational, not nationalistic, actually.
Right.
An integrated civilizational, like petite bourgeois, small c capitalism, which I think is impossible. Like, I just don't think that's a viable economic form. But you could see him arguing that was perfectly fine, as well as, because what he doesn't want to argue is, even though he wants his Tsarism back, he doesn't actually seem to want to argue that feudalism was a good thing, which is one of the interesting positions that modern reactionaries get themselves in. Like, they might even argue for the monarchy. They are not ever arguing for the reimposition of feudalism. And if they are hiding it like a mofo. Like, they won't even admit that to their constituency, which I find that to be interesting, just something to observe. Like, why? Okay, so you want your traditionalist worldview back, right? But you don't want feudal power relations, and why not? You don't believe in human equity, So why not? And you never really get them answering that. Like, because it's too unpalatable? Because...
Well, yeah, Marxism could do itself a lot of favors by having arguments about the mode of production primarily, instead of having basic philosophical ideological crusades around rather than through the question of the mode of production. Because of that exact thing.
So the battle for postmodernity is fourth political theory deals with a new reincarnation of an old enemy. It challenges liberalism, much like the second and third political theories of the past, but it does so under new conditions. Right. Blah blah blah. Now it's interesting here. We start to get what he means by the end of history, because this is where something where like he does this in just a sentence, but he actually illustrates an understanding of, say, Francis Fukuyama and like the liberal, the French European liberal view of Hegel, that what Hegel was actually on about. This is different from the Marxist view, and I like to remind you of it because you can be a little bit more Hegelian-centric than me. But that people mocking Francis Fukuyama without being able to prove that Francis Fukuyama is wrong, despite some of the more like absurd parts of the End of History book, the End of History and Last Man.
Yeah. Like I remember in the ISO, we talked about Francis Fukuyama all the time. It's like a regular like quip that people could make. But all we were really saying was that like, hey, the left still exists, and it didn't at the time either. But that was all anyone was ever actually saying. I don't believe anyone ever even really contended with the whatever he was actually putting forward. I don't think anyone ever even read it.
His argument is basically as follows. Now it's couched in a lot of like obscure terminology for no fucking particular reason, but like Fukuyama basically argues that the end state of history was achieved in liberal modernity because in recognizing self-spirit, it in its atomization, it recognizes self-autonomy in a way that is appealing to everyone as an abstract. So that it always has the advantage of large people viewing themselves as individuals, and thus, ironically, because they are different, also fundamentally the same. And because of that, it can appeal to everyone's intrinsic self-interest, and thus it's very hard to defeat. That's Fukuyama's argument, kind of stripped down of its weird, unnecessary use of Greek and its Kojavian Hegelianese about stats and whatever else. But that's what the end of history is about. Now, the reason why I point this out is that I want to say that Dugin's actually a fairly astute reader of Kojève and of Fukuyama. And one of the things that I'm impressed about this book is that even though some of his references are dated, he seems to actually understand the American ideologies of the ruling class that leftists just kind of like drop because we think they're gauche.
Right.
Like we don't talk about Fukuyama. We don't talk about Huntington. We just kind of write all that off. And I'm like, Huntington and Fukuyama, you are more likely to read than Karl Marx if you go to an Ivy League university, even though they seem like, like the dumb form of political science. And I think people need to sit with that a little more. One, it implies that our elites are stupider than we think. But two, I do think we ignore this at our peril. And if anything, for example, I read Francis Fukuyama's The Origins of Political Order and Political Order and Decay, which are a series of books he wrote in the aughts and aught teens. Long. It's kind of his like capital, actually, except he's trying to look at like what establishes political order. How do you play self-interest off of each other? How do you like get out of Thucydides' traps? Why is this the end of history, and how did we get here? And what about like Christianity and the political economy of Christianity, etc.? Let us there, right? It's actually a very smart book. Nobody fucking talks about that book in our circles because you can't just simply make fun of it.
Right.
It's not like the history like, 9/11 disprove that. It's or whatever we say now. And one of the things I am of, and I also point out about Fukuyama did not think that liberalism winning was necessarily good, because
No,
tied,
I don't think he did
yeah,
at all. Yeah.
in fact, like tied into his predictions is what he aims to do is take Hegel, remove Hegel from Marx, go back to the center Hegelians, basically.
Right.
But also to put Hegel in dialogue with Nietzsche and what was, what then the hip, trendy post-Marxist things to do on the quote left, unquote. Which is weird to me that Nietzsche became so important to the left, but nonetheless, that's what he was aiming to do, and say like Nietzsche's not wrong about what it implies about human character and greatness, and all that. All this is over. We're in the administrative world now, and
Right.
and Fukuyama says this is even what Marx wants. He does talk about Marx. He's like, when Marx talks about the administration of things, like we're there. Like we got to it without communism. Like, and now again, I would point out that James Burnham and Pareto in the Italian elite school all already made that argument like in the 20s. But so just so people know, it wasn't new, but it is pretty interesting that that's where this is coming from. And that's the form of liberalism, in the understanding of liberalism, that Dugin's aiming at, not like anti-liberalism. I actually find it interesting that he's not taking the dumb, caricatured, woke view of liberalism as obnoxious wokeness or whatever as his
Right.
enemy,
Right.
which most like, quasi pseudo traditionalists like Jordan Peterson would try to do in America today. Like, he does not try to start from a straw man on this, which I actually think is interesting, given that he will do, like, I've heard Dugin talk on Alex Jones and whatnot. He'll do it if it's conducive to him, but that's not in the core of his thinking.
Yeah,
And that,
that's not his main crusade. Because
right.
really, like, as you read this book, you kind of have to learn about liberalism, like what it actually means, what it actually is, even in order just to contend with it, because it's Dugin's operating and writing on such a higher level than honestly even what most Marxists or whatever, most people on the left even believe is possible anymore.
So
And
when I read this,
it's
yeah, go ahead. No, when I read this book the first time, I read two other books immediately upon reading it, which is Domenico Lacerdo's Liberalism and Counter History, which is okay as far as it goes. It's like, there's, the more I learn about Lacerdo's politics, the more there's some things that I was like, aha, I'm on to you. You dungest. But there's also things in there. I read Jonathan Israel's like 5-part, probably 60,000 words once you read them all together, or more, like 3,000 pages history of liberalism and the different strands of liberalism. And he like has a left, right, center, and radical liberalism and all this stuff. And I needed to read that to even begin to create a response to this, because I do think you're right that Dugin does want you to think about what liberalism is, but he wants you to think about what liberalism is in abstract, in its ideological apparatuses, not the historical processes, not just the economic processes,
right,
because I do
right.
think that can be too limiting. But the historical processes that led to it.
Yeah.
And I don't know why he doesn't want to go there, but it does seem like it's, given what he's clearly read, he could, but he doesn't. And so that's going to be one of the things, like, that's my heuristic of suspicion, other than just like disagreeing with his right-wing politics. So rethinking the past and those who lost, he starts honing in on, figures of of the quote third position are what's sometimes called the right wing critique of conservatism, reactionary thought. He also looks through figures who tried to read left ideas through rightist lens and vice versa.
Right. Yeah.
And he does this because he thinks that the problem I mean, I skipped over reading this, but he says that the problem with modernity is like the third position critiqued liberal capitalism from the position of the right of traditional integrated corporate society or race, depending.
Right. Yeah.
And the second position, which of course Marxism never calls itself the second position. Again, that whole framework implies a accepting of validity as fascism that Marxists would never grant, but critiques it from the left, the standpoint of the oppressed, the excluded, and the particularly in Marxism, the exploited.
Right.
And that he's like, well, the fourth political position's got to come from beyond both. We basically, as Marxism said to liberalism, we will actually deliver on the bourgeois values of which you cannot. He says that basically, fourth positionism's got to say to fascism, we're going to be beyond left and right because you couldn't do it.
Right.
Like, which is an interesting way to view this. Although this is the kind of stuff where people go, well, he's really a fascist. I would say like, no, but I think you have more of a point there than you realize, because there is a way in which, like, part of the way in which Marxist ideologically can't get past their liberalism is that we also do come out of taking its essential values framework as more or less valid.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
You could actually see fourth positionism here going like, well, you're wrong about race and you're wrong about the corporate state, but you're onto something about traditional civilization. So if we lean in traditional civilization by inverting the causes of the left and right split in the first place, which is rooted in modernity, we can go back to being beyond left and right because we have inverted the positions of which it comes, which again means that we have to recognize this as a fundamentally reactionary project from the standpoint, not from just a Marxist standpoint, but from the standpoint of like de Maistre and reactionaries themselves. Like,
right.
We cannot go back to the past, but we can bring the past back because because the forces that destroyed the past actually got rid of the dead weight of the past. And now we can use that to build the past anew and better and stronger. Like that's the Master vision,
That's part of what the whole building a civilizational state rather than a nation state. That's a big part of it. Is like the nation, in the emergence of the nation, was a scattering that modernity imposed upon much more coherent civilizations. And so, we've been living with the detritus of that event, but now we can reverse all of that.
But that is interesting to me, though, that like he sees like national Bolshevism as what the rest should attach to, and not like neo-Christendom. I do find that interesting. Like, yeah, he believes in Christendom for Russia, but he doesn't seem to believe it for the West. And I want to get into like why you think he might feel that way, because that is weird to me.
I mean, I think it's really weird. So, I mean, one thing could just be that, like, and I don't really know, it's just a guess, but like Christendom, for a Russian and for a person in the East, is actually a lot more pre-modern because of what Eastern Orthodoxy and its rituals and its eschatology and all of it, in a way that Christianity in the West, because of the Protestant Reformation and the way that the Catholic Church then tried to like adjust itself in order to stay relevant, that's all modernity. It's pre-modernity. It's actually what gives rise to liberalism and so on. So if you just talked about Christendom in the West, you're not necessarily getting at the same thing as you're talking as you would in Russia. So that's at least one possibility for why. But also, like, National Bolshevism has no no grounds at all. There's no popular basis for it at all, as opposed to Christianity.
Yeah, that's what I don't like. That's what I don't understand, because I'm like, often neo-fascist movements will latch on to race and then religion because there's a popular basis through religion. Like Golden Dawn operates through the resistance around um Islamic incursion on the Greek Orthodox Church, in addition to
Right,
whatever
right.
racial complaints that it has. Casa Pound often will speak the language of distributism and whatnot, and of Pio Nono and Pope Pius IX, um, and the rejection of both communism and liberalism in the Second Council of Trent, etc. Like that's that. Like they'll do that explicitly, in addition to whatever other like normal fascist bullshit they do. And why they Casa Pound actually harbors national Bolshevik uh ideological structures. They don't talk in those terms most of the time. And I find that, and in the like softer post-fascism in Italy, you definitely don't see like strong, like Maloney's not appealing to national Bolshevism.
Yeah, like
Like,
at all.
yeah, and so like that seems to be like, I don't know if that's like coming from a weird Russia-centric point of view, or
It
like
might be.
I'm like, maybe Bolshevism has more of a calling card. Like, I'm trying to think of like what, like if I was trying to make weird crazy calls about Russia through an American lens, what would I do? And I mean, I know the most common one is to treat Dugin like he's Alex Jones. Um,
I mean, he's kind of like Alex Jones. He's just
way smarter.
um he's way smarter, more pleasant to encounter and to interact with, or whatever, intellectually. But socially, he kind of plays the same role in a huge way, anyways.
Well, it seems like when I was reading about stuff that he was up to after he lost his professor position, which again makes him very different than Alex Jones.
Yeah, right.
He got involved in like a neo politically orthodox like news channel that went nowhere. So in that sense, yes, and he also, but it's also interesting because one of the things about fourth political theory that makes it somewhat useful, and this I do want to talk a little bit about, and this is not in this book, but there's a strong appeal in Islamist communities for Duginists. Like that's real. Like they do outreach explicitly to Islamists and stuff like that, which is different from other forms of European New Right.
Yeah,
Who,
like vastly different.
yeah, I mean, who often are very anti-Islamist.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting difference, and it does, and that doesn't seem to have any theological problem for Dugin. I mean, there are paradoxes in Dugin's like religiosity. I mean, I do know that he like came out of an occult stuff in the 90s, and he was kind of in that fascist occult world and I don't say that as a slur, like it's like he admits this.
Yeah, right.
Um but that he became much more enamored in the Orthodox Church, but he doesn't frame his ideologies, at least not to non-Russian speakers, in those terms at all. But
Well,
the
I
reason
think that's part of why I mean, that's one thing about what he has said, at least up to this point, which kind of shows him to be a genuine in his appeal. I mean, in terms of what he's actually trying to appeal to, because in the Russian civilization, sure, Christianity is the thing, but in the Arab civilization, just adopting these terms, Islam is the thing, and to oppose that would be one of the forms of racism that he thinks we should reject. So, however paradoxical it is, it is at least it's honest and it's it's genuine.
There is a genuine pluralism in terms of the world. There's not a genuine pluralism in terms of individual society. Like he thinks all these individual societies have a right to exist, and that basically, I mean, it's interesting. I mentioned Samuel Huntington because it's interesting pairing like this with the class of civilization stuff, because like basically Dugin's like, yeah, Samuel Huntington's right, and we're gonna win. But all these other like forms of life, if they didn't impose their will on us, we would not have a problem with them. Now, of course, I've heard that before. Socialists used to say that about the Jews and blame them for communism. But so I'm like, for someone who's familiar with other Russian right wing thinkers, I'm like, I'm on to this to some degree. But he does seem sincerely to believe that like these other world forms have legitimacy, except for maybe liberalism. If there's a non-liberal Americanism, he might be okay with it. Like, and that is interesting, because that actually puts him at deviance with like the Orthodox Church and this idea of the Universal Catholic Church. It does.
Well, and in later in chapter 2, he talks about what from liberalism is worth saving. Mm-hmm. Even his anti-liberalism is not it's not total. It's just he just takes for granted that it's run its course and it has overreached, and so it needs to be done away with. But not every single aspect of what it has brought to the world needs to be done away with.
This I find
freedom.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
This I find interesting, though. I'm going to read most of this section because this is another place where his traditionalism actually becomes clear in the Four Political Theory. We're in the section called The Return of Tradition and Theology, and I might read most of it, just warning. Tradition, religion, hierarchy, family, and its values were overthrown at the dawn of modernity. Actually, all three political theories were conceived as an artificial ideological constructions by people who comprehended in various ways the death of God, Friedrich Nietzsche, the disenchantment of the world, Max Weber, the end of the sacred. This was the core of the new era of modernity. Man came to replace God, philosophy and science replaced religion, and rational, forceful, technological constructs took the place of revelation. Now, this is where Dugin is more like Alex Jones than David Graeber. But it's also interesting because this is, I'll keep going. However, if modernism is exhausted in postmodernity, then at the same time, this period of theomachy comes to an end along with it. I think this is smart, because other people in 2008 were not predicting this. Postmodern people are not endemical towards religion, but rather indifferent. Moreover, certain aspects of religion as a rule, such as Satanism and the demonic texture of postmodern philosophers, are quite appealing to many postmodern individuals. This is another place where he sounds like Alex Jones, but he has like some interesting reasons for believing it. In any case,
the difference is that he kind of backs it up, and it's not just a thing to say,
Right. It's not just, oh, these people are Satanists. It's like, well, no, like this stuff has like this rebellion, it's not just that people have become rational. It's like in dealing with the rebellion of religion, they've actually like created a not really truly believed counter religion, like Baphomet pins and whatnot. I mean, like, look, I have one somewhere. Right. And that, like, Satanism is not really, people don't really believe it, but there is a sense in which you see this even more now than you did in 2008, 2009, as a kind of like ironic embrace of rebellion in a time where we're not really that ironic anymore. Anyway. In any case, the era of persecuting tradition is over. Although, following the logic of post-liberalism, this will likely lead to the creation of a new global pseudo-religion based on the scraps of disparate syncretic cults, rampant chaotic ecumenicism, and, quote, tolerance. Again, sounds like Alex Jones. Well, this turn of events is in some ways more terrifying than direct and uncomplicated dogmatic atheism and materialism. The decrease in the persecution of the faith may offer an opportunity if the representatives of fourth political theory act consistently and uncompromising in defending the ideas and values of tradition, capital T. It is now safe to institute a political program that was once outlawed by modernity. It is no longer foolish and doomed for failure as before, because everything in postmodernity looks foolish and doomed for failure, including its most glamorous aspects. It is by chance that the heroes of postmodernity are freaks and monsters, transvestites and degenerates. This is a new law of style. Against its backdrop of the world's clowns, for those of you who wonder where Clown's World comes from, I actually think it comes directly from this, translated through 4chan, and I'm being serious. Nothing and no one could look too archaic. Not even the people of tradition who ignore the imperatives of modern life. This was like this actually is kind of a kind of simpler version of Alain de Benoit or de Benice. I'm never quite sure how to say it.
I think it's Benoit, but I don't actually know either.
Alain de Benoit's On Being a Pagan. If you ever find that book, I read it in the early aughts.
I'm going to write that down.
The fairness of this assertion is not only proven by significant achievements of Islamic fundamentalism. I do think it's interesting how fast Islamic fundamentalism, like, just maybe it's because the left doesn't want to deal with it. I don't know, but it's just been like, we don't even talk about that anymore. But also by the glowing influence of extremely archaic Protestant sects, dispensationalist Mormons, and so on American foreign policy. I think this is interesting because this was very true in 2009. I don't think it's true now, but in the ways it's not true, it actually backs up his first assertion against the second, that like now tradition just doesn't, everything's so weird that this doesn't seem weird anymore. And it doesn't have, like, we're not scared of dispensationalists anymore because all of it's a joke.
Yeah.
Like, you know, George W. Bush went to Iraq because, in his own words, God told me to invade Iraq. This is quite in keeping with his Protestant Methodist teachers. No, it's not, dude. Like, Bush was a milquetoast Methodist. Anyway, thus, the fourth political theory, there are times where, like, I'm just going to say this, where Dugin seems to believe, like, bullshit American, like, simplifications of our own history. Dugin actually trusts us on misunderstanding our own past. It's very weird. Like,
I was going to say the same thing. Like, it seems like he's deeply familiar with some aspects of, like, you know, philosophical and academic and intellectual Western, like,
and Western
life,
media.
But in other areas of the way that Western life is presented to the world, he seems to be extremely naive and fairly uneducated. At least in this regard, yeah.
It's very weird, actually. Like, thus, the fourth political theory may easily turn everything that preceded modernity in order to draw on its inspiration. The acknowledgement of God's death ceases to be mandatory imperative for those who want to stay relevant. The people of postmodernity are already so resigned to this event that they can no longer understand it. Who exactly died? But in the same way, the developers of fourth political theory can forget about this event. We believe in God, but ignore those who talk about his death, much like we ignore the words of madmen. And I think this is trying to have your cake and eat it too. And I don't think it actually works, but I do see where he's going with this. Right.
I mean, I could totally understand, like, why he would be going that way, but I think I probably agree with you.
It's like, dude, people, like, try to do this "we believe in God" stuff, but it never sticks. It just doesn't. Like, Jordan Peterson, like, who's become kind of the voice piece of America's religious reaction, cannot even say clearly he actually believes in a physical, personal God.
Right, exactly.
Like, he gives me garbity gook that sounds like Young plus Lacan, that sounds like it was pulled from Deleuze and Guattari. Like, whenever you ask him a straightforward, like, demons are this manifestation of this ethical blah blah vital blah blah blah. Like, it you just, like, and so in a way,
what he sounds like is he sounds like a person who recognizes that there's a value in speaking in a way that other people will understand, but he doesn't quite do it very well. But either way, he sounds like a person who's, you know, trying to sound like more authentic than even he feels that he actually needs to be.
Right. Well, I mean, it's funny to me that these are like the great, and this is something I find even true in Dugin. The great opponents of postmodernity actually take postmodernity at face value in a way that I don't think you probably can.
Wait, we talked about this last time. If you know, if it was just recognized as the decadent expressions of modernity, it would be a lot easier to like to contend with and also to ignore. But once it becomes its own phenomenon, it also has to be taken seriously and contended with in a way that I think it doesn't deserve. And that plays out here.
This is interesting though, because this is where you see what the political theology that Dugin's actually operating from. But you're also right, Jason, that he really is a pluralist. Like he's serious about that.
Yeah.
This marks the return of theology and becomes an essential element of the fourth political theory. When it returns, postmodernity, globalization, post-liberalism, the post-industrial society is easily recognized as the kingdom of the Antichrist. This, by the way, this is Derek talking. This is why I think he has no problem like going on to Alex Jones and talking this crazy religious talk. It's not because he literally believes it in the same way Alex Jones does, but he does like metaphorically believe it in the same way Alex Jones does. Like, I mean, this is where it's wild. Like you can see how like weird conspirituality plays into this.
I like that word, conspirituality.
Yeah. For its counterparts in other religions, Dajjal for Muslims, Ivrav for Jews, Kali Yuga for Hindus, Kali Yuga for Buddhists too, and so forth. This is not simply a metaphor capable of mobilizing the masses, but a religious fact, the fact of the apocalypse.
Yeah, and I think he does. I think he believes that.
Yeah,
and I think he takes for granted that various figures on the right in the U.S. also believe that, but they don't, at least not in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, this is where things get weird because he does seem to think that some of the members of even the U.S. far right are more sincere than I think they are. Like, right. It's just
exactly.
And this is another thing that ties him to fascism, at least to Sorelianism, maybe not the fascism proper. Is he believes that myth and events super fucking important, even if it's not true. Like,
I mean, I kind of do too, a little bit, anyways. Like, I at least I think that it's worth seriously considering what is meant whenever a person's talking about such things, as opposed to just writing it off. But
this is what's interesting.
I only kind of do. Yeah.
This is what's interesting because he doesn't want to go back to pure theocracy, and this I'll read this too. If atheism in the new era ceases to be something mandatory for fourth political theory, then the theology of monotheistic religions, which at one time displaced other sacred cultures, will not be the ultimate truth either, or rather may or may not be.
That is interesting.
That's a big claim. I don't see how that's not heretical from an Orthodox Christian standpoint. But
I mean, it is. It's very heretical.
Like, but it's basically like, like there's going to be monotheistic cultures and there's going to be non-monotheistic cultures. That's cool.
It's very much the opposite of the charge of the apostles to go out among all the world and spread the good word or whatever.
It's almost like
don't actually do that.
It's interesting because he seems to both be a Christian but think Nietzsche's point about the universalization of Christianity is right and it leading to liberalism. De Benoit, actually, this is why De Benoit argues for paganism, like because he thinks like it recognizes world plurality, whereas monotheistic religions necessarily tend towards universal and atomistic views of the world. So that so he actually thinks like you got to get rid of you got to kill the single god in your head for a bunch of,
that's what Hegel thought too, except for Hegel just thought it was good instead of bad.
Right. Well, and what's interesting is, this is what I'm going to ask you. Dugin seems to at once think that he's kind of a dark Hegelian. he believes that Hegel was right, but it manifested not in the good freedom of the world, but in the bad governance, administered managerial world of of the end of history. But he actually does seem to think that Hegel was right. Thus, Hegel is wrong because it's bad. So we need to go back to pluralism. But how do we do that if we're Christians? Because if Hegel's right, this is what Christianity ultimately leads to. But Dugin can't have that. So he seems to want to have his Nietzsche and eat it too.
Right.
Like,
I mean, I don't have a response to that. I think you're right. I think he thinks that Hegel's right, and he argues very much from at least a quasi-Hegelian perspective. But then he also argues against himself, even in the next sentence, because I don't think he's yet he hasn't reconciled his own thought, and he even says as much, because he even says, like, at some point the fourth political theory might run aground, it might be for nothing. Hopefully that won't happen, because he's not even like, he's not erecting the fourth political theory. He's just outlining all the things that go into it, including things which are mutually antagonistic. Even though he doesn't exactly say that next part. Yeah.
His out for that is like, well, but like rationality is modern, so fuck it.
Right.
It really kind of is that simple. Like, I'll literally read it. Theoretically, nothing limits the possibilities for in-depth readjusting of ancient archaic values, which can take their place in the new ideological construction upon adequately recognized and understood. Hey, look, I'm a Lester McIntyre fan. I'm all about archaic values. But eliminating the need to adjust theology to the rationalism of modernity, the adherents of fourth political theory. I don't need you to give me all this stuff, ebook. All right. The adherents of fourth political theory are free to ignore those theological and dogmatic elements in monotheistic societies which were influenced by rationalism, and especially in their later stages. So, so much that
that's the problem. Because, sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, just it's like you said before. He's very much he's very in favor of a pluralism, but also very in favor of not exactly monotheistic, but hegemonic cultures. So these two concepts are at odds, because multiculturalism and pluralism in the liberal world means you as an individual can exist as an autonomous individual, entirely hermetically sealed off from the culture around you, and that's no good. But he also, at the same time, he thinks that once you find the right one, you stay there. The division is essentially its national borders. So Islamic society and Christian society can coexist as long as they don't bleed into each other. And
right, as long as they ignore their universalizing imperatives, which is central to their identity.
Well, I mean, maybe that's why he doesn't tell the West and figures in the West to go for Christianity, because that's too many monotheistic hegemonic cultures. There can only be one Christianity, and that's in Russia. And then also Islamic society is also okay. And then in the West, they need to go back to their paganism.
So the paranoid part of me goes, so the pluralism is about dividing the world so Russia can conquer it.
I mean, possibly. In fact, I would even say that until he proves otherwise, we can even just assume that.
Yeah. Yeah, what's interesting though? One of the things I do appreciate about this book, like I've read a whole lot of Deleuze, Guattari, and Badiou on the event. And we finally get like somebody who's willing to like, hey, we got this from Heidegger, and here's what Heidegger meant by it. And we're going to actually explain that first before we go off on our long, weird, idiosyncratic use of this concept, which may or may not actually be related to its original usage, but you can't tell that because we're just going to throw the word around.
Right.
Which I have to admit is refreshing after reading so much left theory that are like, blank in the event, and you're like, well, but like what version of the event are we talking about? I think you're referring to Heidegger, but you don't actually say it. Like,
well, honestly, that's what I was saying before. Like, it's really too bad that somebody on our side is not doing this work instead, because I do think it's necessary. It's in the final analysis, I disagree. I think I disagree entirely even. But all the steps along the way to that final analysis, they all need to be taken, because this is so much more intellectually stimulating, and you know, whatever. It's so much more intellectually stimulating than anything on the left that at least that I know of that has come out in like 10 to maybe even 20 years.
I would maybe go further than that. I mean, one of the things I would say is like, since post-structuralism, a lot of the stuff that he's talking about has been taken as de rigueur, and like we just all understand it, but we don't all understand
Right.
it, including the people who study it. Um, and and that's been maddening to me. Like me having to go and like do all these intellectual genealogies so that people understand, like, hey, this concept you throw around as if it's somehow copacetic with Marxism. Here's its actual history. Here's where it comes from. Here's how these people are using it. And in no way are people actually admitting that they're using this in this weird specific way. In fact, they're hiding
Right.
their arguments most of the time.
I mean, I think that's what Hegel means whenever he was referring to the need to move beyond the love of knowing to actual knowing, because you can't just like inherit like a series of ideas and be like, that's good enough. You actually have to contend with them. You actually have to learn what they mean in order to move beyond whatever you would know by virtue of rote memorization. And I think, for whatever flaws that Dugin has already displayed and will display from here on out, I think that he actually does know things, and that makes it him way better than, well, let's say most figures today, anyways.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about a book that is ironically very similar to this, but way more frustrating because it doesn't define its terms. I've been reading a lot of Bang Chul Han, and there's a lot of Heidegger and all this uncited and unrecognized. And there's also a lot of like bad political economy because of the words of political economy, like neoliberalism and this and that are and value and all this are invoked, but completely removed from the historical and or political economic context. But sometimes they seem to mean like, because you get this stuff about like how like we've transcended the need for physical value because of the internet, blah blah blah, very Baudrillardian, and you're just like, no, we haven't. Like the internet still runs on physical machinery. It still depends on commodity production. Like,
Yeah, the internet is not just a thing floating around. It's produced by machines and maintained by machines and infrastructure, and you have to
yeah.
heavily invest, and you have to like repair, and all the same basic criteria for capital in 1860. It's all still there even today.
So you get all these thinkers that do this, and like, but I'm picking up Bang Chul Han, but we also went through that whole theory, some of which was more rigorous than Bang Chul Han, of techno neo feudal thinkers, and
Oh
every
yeah.
time
Oh
I'm
yeah.
like I'm like, but like we still live in a physical economy, and that's still physical infrastructure that holds all this together. It's not like just the ether in which the cloud is in. That's a fucking uh physically maintained like computer with a real thing that requires real energy and real cooling water, and like it's, and you got to feed people to make like the whole thing
Yeah,
just
you've got to own some land and build a building and then fill it with computers, and then you have to have satellites, and then you have to like, I mean, whatever. We could spend an
right,
hour talking about all the infrastructure necessary.
which is just maddening to me because there's so much left theory that in some ways is worse than Dugin, because it's not just that Dugin's operating on the like liberalism does whatever. He doesn't get into this stuff the way we're doing right now, but at least he tells you what the fucking terms mean. He doesn't just
Yeah.
like, and their origins and how he's pulling them from, like, you read so much left theory, particularly if it's influenced by the French, and it's just assuming that we all know what all these terms mean, except that they're all redefined idiosyncratically every time, and those definitions
Right.
are not given. So
I
it's
mean, that was kind of the reason why the measures taken started, because like, you know, you become a leftist and you join some group of, I don't know, somewhere from 100 to 1,000 people, and then you inherit a position and a whole set of positions, and then a bunch of terms, and you just assume that your inherited version of them, you just assume that's what they mean, but you actually don't know at all.
yeah. All right. So I'm going to get us through this chapter. Heidegger and the event, and I think this is interesting because what this spawned my whole thought, because I've been thinking about like the use of event in Badu, in Deleuze and Guattari, and in like Zizek, and the way like it even shows up in fucking podcasts today, and yet no one knows what it's in reference to. Like in this, it's not like people read it upon Marxism. Like, there's no event shit in Marxism. We don't really care about that.
Right.
Like, um, that's like a Baduian concept, and lo and behold, I remember it coming from a Heidegger. But since I like didn't put together that what was happening was this was Heidegger as read through Sartre, as read through Deleuze and Guattari, as responded to by Badiou, then reinterpreted for an English-speaking audience by Zizek and American academics doing commentary on it, and then grafted onto either traditional Marxist-Leninism or traditional Leninism, aka Trotskyism, depending on the
Right.
sect, in a way that made no fucking sense. Like, this happened over and over again, particularly in like the time just after Occupy. One of the good things about, I mean, I say this is kind of a backhanded compliment or insult, but like one of the good things about the DSA is it made Marxism much more dumbly vulgar. But
Yeah.
so like now there's a little bit less of this like dependence on Lacanian theoretical frameworks, or but or use of ontology or whatever. But anyway, they get us to the Heidegger section on the event, and he actually specifically uses uh Erigenes, which let me actually make sure I don't. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering that word. I'm never sure. All right. Just to do a little bit to make sure that I am not totally yeah, which also can be Veranstaltung or Vorgang, all right, which is event. It's kind of a specific usage of German, and the event, and the reason why it's an event is it's to move it away from either, and this is interesting, idealism or Marxian materialism, because the event is not a thing, it's not a thing, nor is it an idea. It is something temporal, but not physical.
Huh.
All right. And that's what Heidegger is getting at here. And he's getting at it because being is an event. It is neither just your
Right.
physical being, nor is it just an idea. All right. Now, this is where like I had to go back into my undergraduate notes on Heidegger. I'm mad. It was hard for me to find that shit. It was like in a Word file, like that's barely openable. Anyway,
It's good that you saved that though.
yeah, I saved a lot of my philosophical notes. Some of them I saved physical handwriting of. I actually, when I was abroad, I didn't keep much, but I kept in my parents' house 2 cases of my handwritten notes on readings from college. I guess that tells you how
One
much
day,
of a fucking nerd I am. But like,
what one day, whenever someone's trying to compile the collected works of Mr. C, then everyone will be very happy that you did that.
yeah, it'd be very funny if they try to correct the collected works of Mr. C if I don't actually ever finish anything but books of poetry.
Well, I mean, you could be a lot like Bakunin. He never finished anything, and yet
Yeah.
it's all published now.
Our Sasser, who like literally his published works are all actually the notes of his students from his lectures. Like,
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what's on. That's the thing about event, and then there's 2 ways in which event is kind of is broadened. And one of the things I both love and hate about German philosophy is like a lot of it seems to be based on wordplay that is obvious in German, but not at all obvious in English. So like, so there's pure being, sign. All right. There is a being, synode, and there's being in the world or being there, Dasein, and then being in itself, which is sin. All right.
Right.
So, and being it like this, being itself is a Kantian category, but and again we go all the way back as almost to piss off Carlos Garrido of Midwestern Marx, who blames everything bad in the West on the fact that we like Parmenides and don't like Heraclitus.
Oh.
Dugin does the opposite. The failure was already obvious in the teachings of Heraclitus about phusis and logos, and it is obvious in Parmenides and finally in Plato, which placed ideas between man and existence, and that truth was acknowledged as correspondence to them. And what Heidegger's getting at is no, truth is actually, it is not either your idea nor the physical world. It is this third category that emerges from being in the physical world, which is being itself. So you move from epistemology and physics and metaphysics into ontology, right? And you will hear leftists throw this shit around all the time without going into the exact meaning of what Heidegger was getting at by this. Why is ontology not metaphysics? And this is why.
Well, because metaphysics, that's bad. Because materialists don't like anything metaphysical. So
right.
That's the only reason. Just because it can't be. Because if it is, that would make, that would mean you'd have to reassess, everything that you think about the world.
Is a metaphysics, however.
Well, yeah, of course.
So, and according to this idea, referential theories of knowledge necessarily give birth to alienation. Our calculating thinking are what they would call instrumental reason. Are what Adorno, the anti-Heidegger. There's a lot of fun. It's funny. One of the funniest things about studying a lot of Adorno and a lot of Heidegger is you're like, they hated each other, and yet they actually came to many of the same conclusions. So,
well, yeah, you can't square off that much without influencing each other.
So what is interesting about this, though, is, there's a Heideggerian terminology about authenticity of being that's anti-technological, because alienation leads to development of technology, which is a misapplication of being by extending rationales, and thus further alienating yourself by taking away from what could be human and giving it to what is now machinery, as mistaking that machinery for yourself because you see it as manifesting your real through a rational agency, as opposed to dealing with it as a non-extension of your being. And for those of you who are, that is garbity gook barn. I'm just saying what Heidegger believes. And thus, it's interesting because what Heidegger's doing is Heidegger is going into like the Hegelian, like longue durée history of philosophy, that you get like the Stoics and are gated by blah 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 blah.
Right. Yeah.
And he's reading Nietzsche back into that. So Heidegger is like Kojève separately trying to like get Nietzsche, and definitely like Fukuyama, get Nietzsche and Hegel on the same plane, which is very hard to do. All right. Because
I don't think it necessarily can be done.
Right. Well, yeah, Nietzsche's an anti-systemic thinker. Hegel is the systematizer.
They start from opposite presuppositions. And so there might be some overlap of certain ideas, but they can't ever be fully united, because that's like saying being and also non-being at the same time together.
I agree, although it's interesting that what you see in both Hegel and in Nietzsche, and this may be, to go meta philosophical or a bit, what may be at reach here is like some realizations in German philology about ancient Greek thought. Is that you had all these people realizing that there was an attempt to deal with this in Heraclitus that kind of gets dropped in idealism, and you have this idealism materialism split, like, or idealism empiricism split. Then it becomes idealism materialism, like, so you might be looking at me, but like if you look at Western philosophy, you start off with like nominalist and substantists. Then you move to rationalist and empiricist. Then you get to idealist and materialist. And now you're whatever the fuck we are now, continentals, which is versus analytics, which one is a geographic location, the other is modality. Um but you, I mean, broadly speaking, though, you can see it like people who believe that math was true or people who believe that the physical universe as observed by the senses was true. That's empiricist versus rationalist. Rationalists are kind of idealist. Nominalists who believe that like experience is outside of the world of categories and the categories aren't real. That they are nominal to describe the numinousness of God's universe, which are self a reflection of God. So all names we give to them are necessarily not substantial enough. So they're all provisional. And then there are essentialists who are closer to Platonics, who are like, no, these are all essential truths. There's essential and contingent truths. And if you actually play out the kind of meta logics of these movements, you can kind of see how one leads to the other till you get to the idea, until you get to the distinction between rationalism and empiricism collapsing in both early German idealism and in Hume. And then two things emerging from that: Hegelian thought, whatever the fuck Nietzsche's doing. And then later on, the split in Kantianism, which is kind of formal neo-Kantianism, and analytic philosophy, which is actually kind of a form of neo-Kantianism, kind of re-reconciled with British empiricism. Now, I will totally admit that's a totally Eurocentric view of the world, like in a philosophy. And like, there's some of these things where I'm like, dude, Buddhists figured this shit out like 2,000 years ago. Like,
well, that's an argument for Dugin's understanding of the way that there's such a thing as a civilizations, and this one is entirely right, but also that one is too on its own terms. And as long as they stay apart, they can communicate and trade or whatever. And there's a certain rationality to that, especially when you consider that Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, there's not like a real synthesis of the two. There's not a merger and coming together of the two.
Well, what's interesting about Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy is that pre-Christianity, all right, what Stoicism and like different schools of Buddhism and different like forms of Upanishadic thought or whatever,
Right.
we don't think of those Hellenistic philosophies as religions, and we do think of the Eastern philosophies as religions, but basically they were both neither and both, and they really do mirror each other in the ancient world. Like they're in dialogue with each other formally. Like they use similar like types of logical argumentation. Even like you can like trace like Platonic dialogues influence on Buddhist dialogues, etc. Then you can go into like stuff that's unique to Eastern philosophy that doesn't really translate very well even as a discourse pattern. And I think what's interesting is there is a real sense, and again, sometimes I sound like a crypto Nietzschean, right? But there is a real sense in which Christianity for the West really changes all that.
I mean, that's when Hegel, when you read his history of philosophy, he treats the Eastern and Western philosophies as a kind of thinking, and then the emergence of the Christian worldview as an entirely new phenomenon, and it's the universalism that it inaugurates. It's for Hegel, it's the highest order of things that has yet been fully realized. And that's not because he loves Europe and he's Eurocentric, although maybe he is also. but it's because it's a different thing than the kind of philosophy that was being done by the ancient Greeks and the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is you go into this eventual thinking and like modern alienation, and basically what you get with Heidegger, and I find this interesting. If you read again the anti-Heidegger Adorno, Jargon of Authenticity is a whole book. Read it just about how awful Heideggerians are. That's all that book is about. You do have weirdos like Marcuse who try to be both Heideggerians and Marxist, but in general, that's not a trend in the Frankfurt School. But what I find funny is the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Horkheimer and Adorno, and Heidegger's engagement with Weber and instrumental reason and rationalization actually tell the same story. And that, except for, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, Heidegger is the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Like he's the rationalist irrationalism that emerges at the end of the process, and that's why, like, that's the problem with liberalism, is it all becomes fascism and all leads to Heidegger. But
and that's bad.
Yeah, and that's bad. But I do think it's interesting how what Heidegger means for a Dugin. And like this is where he's way more philosophically sophisticated. I know I was talking about how he like reminds me of Alex Jones sometimes, but he's way more philosophically sophisticated here.
Well, he plays a similar social role to Alex Jones, but in a different context, which is entirely more sophisticated. Not just because of Dugin the individual, but I think because of the difference between 90s Russia and 90s United States.
I think you're absolutely right. Aughts Russia is where people will stab each other to death over Kant interpretations.
Right.
Like while drunk and also probably getting in a fight about something stupid. But like
in aughts United States, like nothing matters to anybody enough to actually fight. We'll argue online, but no one will fight about anything.
Yeah, I mean, including ending a war, which is killing billions of people. Like,
right? Exactly.
Anyway, but Heidegger. I'll just read what he says here. Being in nothingness, right? The essence of technology, based on the relationship between technology and the world, expresses an ever-increasing nihilism because it removes us from being through extending rationalization. And again, that is similar to Adorno agrees with that, by the way. He uses a Weberian framework and not Heidegger's, but it's very similar.
I don't find it to be as much gobbledygook as I think you said it was, but I don't really want to argue that point.
What?
Because you said it was gobbledygook. And I was like,
what did I say? No, I said if this sounds like gobbledygook to you, I didn't actually. I actually don't think Heidegger's gobbledygook, but I do think you have to like get into this idea of there being a third thing from material and idea called being, which is evental and is a process, but is not a thing. And cannot be reduced to a thing, and fundamentally cannot be known as a thing because being in itself is unknowable. It is unexpressible, right? Like, and for some people that sounds like God. When you start talking about unknowable categories, they're like, "What do you even mean?" Like,
well, listen, there are known knowns, but there are also unknown unknowns, and there are known unknowns.
Right. I find that Rumsfeld quote ends up being philosophically profound way more than it ever should be.
Way more than it ever was intended to be.
Yeah, I know. Postmodernity, which for Heidegger did not live to see its manifestation, is in every sense the ultimate oblivion of being. It is the midnight when nothingness, nihilism begins to seep in all the cracks. Yet his philosophy is not hopelessly pessimistic. He believed that nothingness itself was the flip side of pure being. In fact, in a paradoxical way, mankind's of its existence. I would actually go so far as to say, I've read Heidegger. Heidegger says that nothing exists because of language. And once we realize it in its manifestation only through language, we realize that actually everything is being, not nothing. And
okay, that does sound like gobbledygook.
Yeah. Well, nothing like when he says what nothing exists only through language, like, what is nothing?
Okay.
Like, yeah, exactly. You're like, oh, yeah, I guess I have a word for it, but like, um, and it's kind of like the way zero makes math clearer. Um, now, to get real pissy about it, like, there's these whole thought paradoxes in Hinduism and in Buddhism, where Buddhism argues that everything is empty, it does not have an inherent being, but in its non-inherent being is all potentiality. And then Hindus will argue that like everything is being, and an ultimate being in its various mystic forms is all potentiality. And then they'll go on non-dual and say, well, they both mean the same thing. That nothingness and being are literally the same thing because they're infinite potentiality. Yeah.
I mean, there's a certain rationality to that, but like,
yeah, I have
I
no
don't
idea
know
what
to
that
say
means in
about it.
practice. Like,
Right.
it's like, I mean, yes, in the same way that like there are infinite infinities and there are infinities larger than infinities, even though no infinity can technically be, it's infinitely large. But but if you get into calculus, you realize that like, oh, there are more infinities between, there's an infinite number of infinities between 0 and 1, but there's also double that between 0 and 2. Like,
Right.
um, and then you just go, this only exists because of words. Like, um, but anyway, so Heidegger's special term, which Erenigus, which is, I guess, it is German, but it's like, I think he's the only person who really uses it. um, which is the event, is a certain return to being. And this is what, for people who are like going like, okay, why were you mentioning Badiou? That's what Badiou and them mean by the event and the return to communism. Like there's this return of realization of being, aha, and now the communist hypothesis is possible again. That's what they mean by
Right.
it. And it's a very voluntaristic notion of communism. Like,
I mean, it's extremely voluntaristic.
right. And which is why it was super popular like in the aughts, and it's totally faded now. I don't know how much you've read about Alban Gubner's Two Marxisms, but I very much got into like, well, there's this weird dialectic in Marxism where we're the most voluntaristic, where things feel the most hopeless. And then when we feel like we have hope, we become utterly like productive forces. We're almost there. And then that inevitably doesn't work. So it flips back on itself and becomes voluntaristic again. Like,
Yeah, it's like it's that inability to set the right temperature so that you turn on the cold stream. Oh, it's too cold, and you turn on the warm stream. It's too hot, and for whatever reason, we haven't figured it out yet.
yeah, I mean, that's why I like the Ernest Bloch metaphor more than I like the Guldner metaphor. But Guldner is kind of right about how, like, I mean, he even points out that like Lukács turns into Althusser and Althusser turns into Lukács at the end of their life. It's just like, um, it's just weird. But anyway, so the event, and the reason why, uh, the event is interesting is because there's also the possibility of like being almost realized, but the event that makes it realizable hasn't happened yet. And in that sense, it sounds like the Lenin, like, we need both objective conditions and subjective conditions at the same time, and that rarely ever happens. You often either have subjective conditions or objective conditions, but you got to get one when the other's not around. And like usually you can't get the one that you need by the time that you need it because the other one's gone away. And certain key events for whatever happens, usually world wars, you have this, subjective and objective condition. The caveat to that is, of course, it doesn't happen the way it was supposed to. Like,
Well, yeah,
so,
because the alternative is to be like Plekhanov and just in 1905 just be like, the workers shouldn't take to arms, and Lenin, or you could be like Lenin and say, but they are doing it though. So it doesn't matter if objective conditions aren't exactly right because subjective conditions are, and they're actually overripe. And so if we don't act, then objective conditions will not create the subjective conditions and whatever and so on.
well, what I find interesting is like Marxism and whatever this Heideggerian stuff is, actually rhyme with each other. And Heidegger was very influenced by Marx. He actually calls Marx the most advanced philosopher of history, like even though he's a diehard anti-Marxist, right? And yet,
It's just because he's intellectually honest.
yeah. And yet, one of the things I've always thought, well, one of the reasons why Heidegger appears to so many people is because even though I agree with you, it's not gobbledygook, it is vague.
Oh
Like,
yeah, extremely.
it is vague in a way that Marxism usually isn't, except in Lukács, which is also similarly vague. But so yeah, and then we get to fourth political theory in Russia, blah blah blah, Eurasianism good. I don't really like. I hate to simplify, but that pretty much is what it is.
It's true. This
Although,
this this first chapter kind of like loses steam right before the second chapter, which is actually really deep.
mhm.
But this last section in the first chapter really it kind of needs a rewrite almost.
Yeah, it's basically like we need a Russian event, and that event's going to bring about Eurasianism, and then we'll be history will return, and we'll have the apocalypse of the end of liberalism, and something new will emerge, and these plural societies will be there. And I may or may not think Russia's going to conquer it all. I'm not sure yet. I'm not going to say that out loud. Like, so, I mean, because also like this is the it is interesting. Like, I'll just read parts of this. The current global economic crisis is just beginning. We got to remember this was written in 2009.
Right.
Probably
Yeah.
was drafted in like 2008. The worst is yet to come. The inertia of post-liberal politics is such that the change of course is impossible. To save the West, unrestrained, emancipated technology, Oswald Spengler will search for more efficient but purely technological means. This will be a new phase of the onset of Gestalt. And we got to go back to Spengler's, like, what's good in the West also leads to technology, which undermines the West, which is part of the reason why it's going to decline.
Right.
And thus die. This new phase is the onset of the Gestalt, the spreading of nihilistic strain of the global market of the entire planet. What I find interesting is like all these apocalypses from 2009 both did and did not happen. We have seen globalization start to completely unravel, but it hasn't meant the fall of the old world at all. And that is a bigger challenge for Dugin in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, I guess we'll get to that when we get to this book, but that's something that I think is interesting. This new phase of the unsettling of stale nihilistic global market, moving from crisis to crisis and from bubble to the next, a globalist economy, and the structures of post-industrial society will only make mankind's night blacker and blacker. I mean, as Marxists, we would say that, but we are also forestalled with like, well, why doesn't the bubbles fucking pop? Or
Right.
why don't they all pop at once again? Like, they seem to have only done that in 2007. In fact, it is so black that we gradually forget that it is nighttime. What is light? People ask themselves, having never seen it. Now you can tell he's really into like apocalyptic Christian literature because that's very much Desert Father shit.
It's also just extremely poetic. It's very well written. Even if you don't like it, even if you don't agree with it, it's just like you want to know what he says next.
Oh, I've literally quoted Desert Fathers because it's so cool. I just happen to know what he's kind of referring to. There's lots of like if you don't know like Eastern Orthodox Christianity, there's certain things he throws down in here you're not going to pick up. And I think that's kind of important. Anyway, for example, at the time of the eruption of the 2008 financial crisis, thousands of Americans held demonstrations asking for the government for yet another economic bubble. Could they be more blunt? I mean, I will say that I do sometimes feel like there is a whole lot of the left that's basically give us one more handout to buy time. I feel like that's like half of the fucking program now.
I mean, I think that's basically that's the Bernie Sanders program for the like 4 years. So basically, that's most of the left. You know, there's not so much a road out of the crisis of modern life, but just a stay of execution, so that basically the next generation can figure it out. Not us, though.
Yeah, and so then Russia needs to follow its own path. If you read Dugin's book Putin versus Putin, he clearly thinks that Russia's kind of done that, but not really. I would also say, just looking at realities today, Russia's kind of done that, but not really. Like,
Right.
Like, it was able to really renationalize its markets and revitalize itself for a little while, but that has dried up. We've seen a collapse of the ruble, and yet it's winning the war. I mean, it was like almost like one of the interesting things about the current Russia-Ukraine situation is actually everybody, everybody was wrong. I don't
Yeah.
know a single person who's called most of that correctly on any side, like of all the repercussions, etc. Um, I would say the Russian perspective of it is probably a little bit more honest, but then I think about it and I'm like, oh yeah, but like this Stop Belt and Road initiative, this collapse, this counter power initiative. Uh, China clearly was supposed to start decoupling before it was ready, and is now suffering for it, and won't have the population to do it in the same way in the future. Xi is
Yeah.
clearly having problems, which is why he's purging the military every couple of months. Um, and like at the same time, you see the left doubling down on China as its primary vision for the future, our BRICS, and like, India and China, like some days are pretending to be buds and the other days they're undermining each other, and India's like backing up Russia but also making forays to the West. Like everybody's called everything wrong, including people who called more, like, we always talk about Mearsheimer, but like Mearsheimer called what Russia was going to do completely wrong.
Yeah,
Like,
Mearsheimer has been and still is correct about like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but the impact and the effects and the results, not at all.
and he wasn't correct about what Putin was going to actually do in the beginning of it either.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
um, so it's, conversely, like the United States has not won. You and I go back and forth from this. I can't tell if American leaders really thought that I don't know that they thought that Ukraine would. I think that they wanted us to think that Ukraine would, and they wanted the Ukrainians to think that Ukraine would, and
I think that's right. Yeah.
maybe some planners and definitely politicians swallowed the Kool-Aid, but in the main, the Joint Chiefs of NATO did not. Um,
Yeah, I think
so
like certain like people in the Biden cabinet and the certain people in the Congress definitely thought they bought what they were selling. But nobody whose name we don't know but is in charge, nobody whose name we don't know thought that at all.
yeah, it seems like it was about other things, and nobody really thought that like Ukraine could win this, that they could just like, it was basically like a stress test for the multipolar world, and everybody, including the United States, was found wanting.
Right.
Like, um, anyway, so maybe in that sense things are blacker and blacker, but like the idea that everything was just going to bubble to bubble to bubble. Well, what I've learned is like they're getting really good at timing these bubbles so that another bubble like picks up the falling of it. Like it is not that they've solved the problem of capitalism, because
Not even a little bit.
clearly things have stagnated, but they seem to be being better at, to use Grossmanite terms, finding the countervailing tendencies and pushing them along to stall things while they reorganize a bit, which they've done since the 30s effectively. And when it doesn't work, fascism, or whatever,
I mean, really,
global economic
it really
collapse,
they've
Keynesianism,
done that
etc.
since the 1870s, I think. When was the Long Depression?
Oh, the
Yeah.
Long Depression's like the 1860s, 1870s. Yeah.
So this is basically when once capitalism becomes a global system, that's just the way that it works. There is no final crisis. There never will be. Essentially, we still just have to the same basic needs of the proletariat are still operative today. They're not any different than they were in Marx's day. They're just, everything's just dumber now.
Yeah, I think my theory on this is like the final crisis is a crisis that we actually are able to take advantage of. Like, but other than that, there isn't one. Like this automatic final crisis of which we're in common ruin. I think they figured out how to like manage common ruin, and I think actually interestingly, one of the implications of Dugin is like, yeah, they have, and Russia, we're just not going to go along with that. Like,
Right.
Like, the end of ideology is not random failure, but a beginning of a new stage, and apparently the last one. But we can start the stage again, we Russians, if we have the right event and we have the right ontological and spiritual commitments. And that latter bit is where, like, that voluntarism reminds me of Graeber, but it's like it's a holistic voluntarism. It's not just belief that because Graeber talks about this, you don't just need to believe that another world is possible. You also need to believe, like, you need to have a metaphysical counterbalance for like so he talks about how like highly egalitarian societies have really unegalitarian and violent thought worlds and mythological systems, which probably offset some of the actual human violence and tension. Right. So for Graeber, there is an ontological and like not metaphysical, but like spiritual ideational together, like need, not because he believes the spiritual is real, but because he thinks it offsets certain things in human biology and in human institution building. And
So he believes in it in the same way that like Sorel believes in the spiritual.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, he seems to. And he doesn't come from it for this. Like, he has a whole chapter about how much he hates Sorel, but like, it's a very similar, like we need myth because myth is going to balance out the stuff that enables us to actually build a better world. No, we're not going to talk about the material conditions and like geographic components and all this, because that makes them uncomfortable. But nonetheless, here we go. And interestingly, Dugin also seems to believe that. And like, this is where like I think most me like there is a little bit of like, I'm a pluralist, but Russia's the best. like that's definitely what's going on. Like,
well, yeah, I mean, it's like I don't really know what to say about this exactly, but it's like, because he used to be a fascist, and then he gave up on being a fascist. So his nationalist impulses are all still there, but he recognizes that that's a problem. So he tries to basically he tries to maintain them by offloading them onto civilizational, like, it's bigger, it's Eurasia, it's not just Russia, but also it is just Russia, essentially.
I mean, yeah, that's the whole thing. Like, you will notice that, for example, in the Eurasian world, he does not include China. Like it is not like Eurasia is not Europe and Asia. Eurasia for him is like the lands between. It's basically Central Europe to the eastern edge of Central Asia, and the northern parts of Asia.
I think it's in the next chapter. In the next chapter, he talks about the Soviet Union and the value that the polity of the USSR and also of the Warsaw Pact states, independently of the validity of the ideology that bound it all together. It's just that the USSR and the world around it, that's what we need, but just on a different basis than the USSR itself.
Yeah, so Dasein is an actor, chapter 2, which we're not going to get into today, but I just want to I'm going to preview it so we can kind of build towards it, because we're 2 hours in and I think this is a motherfucker. But I also think very few people, I'm not going to say accidentally myself, has actually read a lot of the stuff you need to understand this chapter, but accidentally myself, I've read a lot of the stuff you need to understand this chapter, because you need to have read Heidegger, European New Right figures like Alain de Benoit, Immanuel Wallerstein, and world systems theory, including Brunel and the non-Marxist and Marxist variants of it.
Carl Schmitt,
Fareed Zakaria, like the amount of stuff, and at first when I suspected, like, oh, he's doing this thing where he's just throwing so much at you can't actually put it all together. But no, I actually, even though it's quick, I actually do think he's read everything he's citing here, because I've read most of this stuff and I see what he's talking about. Like, so I like, to me, this chapter is one of the most interesting chapters in the book. It's also gonna, if you think getting through chapter 1, which took 4 hours, is gonna be a problem, we got to talk about Heidegger. We got to talk about world system theory. We have to talk about neo-Marxism, and neo-Marxism here is not a slur for a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. Not that I think Dugin's above that, but it really isn't what he's doing here. Um, but then we also have to talk about like the particularly the French New Right and Greca
and Giovanni Gentile and
and old fascism and Doron.
also Husserl.
Yeah, and we got to
Yeah.
talk about early 20th century existentialism. And one of the things I hate about modern philosophy is we all treat existentialism like it's a joke now, because it's the philosophy you get into in high school when you read Sartre, Nietzsche, or at least it was in the 80s and 90s, and maybe even in the 70s, right? We read Sartre, Nietzsche, and
I don't think
and
anybody reads anything now, but yeah.
no, they don't. But like, I read Camus in ninth grade, and I'm a working class kid. Like,
Yeah.
I just want to like point that out. What I didn't have an elite educational background, and I read Camus in ninth grade. It was also in the air because I hate to say it, but the early internet was less dumb. Like,
Oh
it
yeah,
just
way
was.
less dumb. Yeah.
So like I remember going to zines and then finding zines and zines websites that I would go to at the school library where I had internet access and like just read on existentialism. And one of the things you realize about existentialism is it's kind of a given for structuralism and post-structuralism, but we treat it like it's a joke now, so we don't study it, even though you kind of have to know it to get what's going on in Sartre and in Deleuze and Guattari and in quote post-structuralism, or even in Althusser. Like there, all this stuff is kind of like in the air, and we don't study it anymore. We take it like we treat existentialism like it's stupid
Yeah,
because
and
there
it's
is a
just
dumb
not
form of
at
it,
all.
right?
Well, sure. There's a dumb form of everything, but doesn't mean that you shouldn't know about it.
Right.
Like the real version of it.
Like I would say, for example, there's a lot more of the dumb form of Marxism right now than the dumb form of existentialism. Like
Yeah.
it's
Well, an example in a different direction. Um, I encountered this kind of thought, back on SovietEmpire.com. It was the pre-app internet,
yeah,
and it was insane. And that made me not, until we started this series, that made me just assume that Dugin was not worth reading. And it actually turns out that Dugin is incredibly worth reading because the dumb guy version of Eurasianism is entirely different from the smart guy version.
absolutely. I mean, for everyone who talks about like, I also used to be a person who complained about academic Marxism until we got vulgar non-academic Marxism back. And then I was like, you know what? Maybe academic Marxism wasn't so bad. Like,
Yeah.
like, although I think honestly, vulgar Marxism actually is a response to the excesses of academic Marxism when reinforced on actual sectarian groups and of unfortunately poorly educated but very intellectually smart college students and occasionally working class people. Like it's
Right. Yeah.
and so there's a lot of like that manifest in vulgar Marxism and also manifest in both left and right wing conspiracism. Like there is a way in which I listen to someone like Alex Jones or QAnon. And I was actually, again, I've been reading too much David Graeber, so forgive me if I make too many Graeber. But Graeber was talking about like the ideological thought worlds of hierarchy and conspiracy necessary to maintain egalitarianism. And I was reading, and I went, that's QAnon.
Hmm.
Like, are they, Graeber, you're egalitarians like in our society, who are afraid of elites against the common people, and are willing to empower a strong man who they think they can control to fight it? Because by the way, that is uh the Albert Michel or Michel Albert. I can never remember which way that goes. Uh, but the elite school of German Italian philosophy, which comes out of anarchism but becomes fascist. The iron law of oligarchy people who go like, well, the way you smash oligarchies is actually executives. And never the twain shall meet. And there are left versions of this, and there are right wing versions of this. Marxist Leninism is one kind, but there's other kinds. I mean, honestly, like a lot of liberals are becoming like Hobbesians for democracy, which is really funny. Like we got to suspend democracy to save democracy from democracy. I mean, the people who
That's
are arguing,
barely even a joke. That's just actually what they actually do think.
yes,
And they
it's
say
not.
that.
It's not a joke. It's like we
Yeah.
have to limit popular choice to save. It's like, it's just like, yeah. And I think I'm gonna say this chapter in particular, chapter 2, is the chapter where, and it's partly because who he's pulling from, because he's putting like world systems theory in direct contact with, frankly, fascist political theology. And I mean, you can't. There's no way to say Smith's not fascist. I know there are leftists
Oh
who
yeah.
try, but like, there's no way to say that Smith's not fascist. Fascist political theology and like talking about how they overlap, and I do think that should disturb people. Like, to me, like as as a as a as a as a Marx critical Marxist, right? Like I do, like I'm even willing to criticize Marx himself, but as a Marxist who's willing to go that far, I do sometimes feel like I'm reading like the smart satanic image of what I believe in this book. Like it's just like, oh,
That's
this is the flip
yeah.
side of my ideology thrown back at me. Like,
I mean,
and
that's why it's compelling, you know?
it is. And I find it very interesting. And I think that's why one of the things I think, and I said this in the first time, this is another thing as we go into this next website, next chapter, the chapter that I think we both think is one of the best in the book.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, okay.
to think about is, why did we amplify Dugin's power to also make him a joke? Like, why was that a liberal? I mean, I know why liberals found Dugin, because he said some things that were scary, and you could pretend that he was like Putin's Rasputin, which is clearly not true, right?
Right. I mean, liberals just do that. That's what they did with Trump as well.
Right, I know, but I want to ask you why the left went along with it, because in this case they did, and then
I mean,
ironically,
I
it
think
made Dugin more compelling later on.
I
Like
think the
that.
left just
Mhm.
takes its cues entirely from liberalism. So liberals decide that Dugin was, the new Rasputin and Putin was the new Hitler, and the left just said that's probably true, and that's it really. And I think maybe there's more to it, but I don't know what else there could be. I just feel like the left does not have an independent doesn't know how to chart an independent course. The left only knows how to tail the liberals.
Well, I'm going to push back on you. When the left becomes cognizant of that, what it often can only do then is tail the right, because it has no sense of what it would be to have an independent stance from liberalism. Like, so
Yeah,
like when you
I
get
think
like,
that's right also.
right, because one of the things I think that demonization, first started by liberals and picked up by some leftists, actually did to Dugin was to caricature him in a way that when you actually read him, you may have made him seem more smart.
Huh. Yeah.
Because I will say, like, one of the differences between you and me about, like, I'm somewhat less impressed by Dugin, but also because I never thought he was stupid. Like, so, like, it's
There's probably a value in that, yeah. Because
like,
I can also I've also had
Right.
like 2 or 3 friends who have told me that like because of this series, they started reading Dugin, and they're like amazed at actually how much smarter he seems. Like,
Yeah.
so I feel like I've got at least a pretty good collection of anecdotal stories that back up your claim about thinking. The way that the liberals erected a kind of a mythology around him actually makes him, upon actual investigation, seem more insightful and better than he might actually be.
This is my fear right now of the current. You know how for years there was all this making Nietzsche safe for liberals and leftists, and now there's a current pushback to make him dangerous again. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
I have a slight fear that in making Nietzsche dangerous again, we're gonna actually go back through the cycle because like we're gonna over respond and people are gonna read Nietzsche and be like, oh well, but there is brilliance here, and then off to the races back again because we've got I was literally reading a book called American Nietzsche, and I was just going through and this was even before the left. That has happened with Nietzsche in the United States 4 times since the 1880s. Like he was he was integrated, then made dangerous, then reintegrated, then made dangerous, and then reintegrated. And we only really know the last round of this. We know like the Walter Kaufman now Nietzsche's really a crypto Nazi round of the Kaufman to Lacerda round. But this has
Mm.
happened before. This has even happened before World War II. So, because German intellectual thought has a weird relationship to American thought. It is um we always deny how much we're like the French, and we always hide how much we're influenced by the Germans. Like it's like a national identity to be like, we're not like the French at all. Fuck those Frenchies. And then we're like, but we're both universalists who believe in our own special exceptionalism, and uh we both take everything and make it ours in ways that are weird. And fuck, we even steal we steal our philosophical traditions from each other, and then get really iffy about it, and then accuse the other one of ruining our thought. Um, and
Well, we even have a little mini France in the South, in Louisiana. We even have like a kind
yeah,
of an altar to how much we're not France by virtue of the fact that we actually are kind of a lot like France.
yeah. I mean, and conversely with Germany in the 19th century, you go back and read Little Women, for example, in German, and everything German is good and it's progressive and it's like. And then after World War II, it's like, oh no, it's all reactionary. And then slowly in the end of the 20th century, when we realized that the British were actually pretty fucked up, after our weird, like liberals, actually not ours. That's a liberal phenomenon. Like liberals had a weird Anglophilia that I never understood. Um, but now it's kind of like, well, we like the Continentals, and by the Continentals we mean pretentious like France, but really run like Germany.
Well, that's because what value is NATO going to have without Germany?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Europe's doing pretty good at making itself irrelevant without our help. But although I will say our help is probably why it got good at making itself irrelevant. So maybe it was just in the past. Um,
Maybe it was just destined to be,
yeah,
and we're just helping along something which was already inevitably going to happen.
the universalization of Europe also means that Europe is destroyed. No, so
Well, until Russia can come and save it and bring it back into Eurasia, but it doesn't include China.
yeah, it's also like sometimes Eurasia includes Europe and sometimes it doesn't, which is why like I think it's interesting. I do want to point this out. It is interesting that Dugin wants everyone to have a civilizational project except for the North Americans and the Europeans. He does not
Right.
want them to have a civilizational project.
Yeah, the Atlanticists are that's the bad civilization.
Yeah, yeah. Those are the orcs for 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 Dugin's Eastern Orthodox Gondor. But it is like it is sort of like all civilizations are good, but that one. Um, Now, what I do find interesting, one thing that we're going to eventually get is he does do interesting things with geography, um, and and in a way that is very 19th century and maybe problematic, but also in a way that I think is weirdly materialist in a way that we've dropped, which is thinking about the way like geographic orientations really do affect the way people think. And he does. I
Well,
don't know.
right.
He gets into that later on when he talks about like why the Atlanticist world is the way it is and why like the landlocked Russian world is the way it is. Like, although my counterpoint to him is I'm like, the United States is also pretty fucking landlocked, actually. We just happen to make it to both coasts. So
Well, yeah, and
like,
if you're a foreign observer of the United States, you encounter the U.S. as either a phenomenon out of New York or a phenomenon out of Los Angeles, which means it's coastal. And so, even though like 90% of the country is actually not coastal, or not 90, maybe 75% of the country is not coastal, it's also not really. It's out of sight, and so it's out of mind.
yeah, I mean, it is funny when you hear Europeans who actually go to the United States and realize like, holy shit, that country's different from place to place, and I'm like, we're bigger than your continent, of course we are. Like,
Well, yeah, like I've had friends be like, "Oh, hey, I'm gonna be in New York. Maybe I'll come see you." I was like,
no,
"I'm
you
in."
won't.
At the time I was in Los Angeles. I was like, "Do you have any idea how far away California is from New York?" That would be like if I said, "Hey, I'm gonna come to Beijing. I might drop by Paris."
Yeah, I mean, it really is that.
Yeah,
Like, I remember when Europeans were like, "Oh my god, you said something 2 hours away was close," and I'm like, "You aren't from here."
yeah. 2 hours away is close.
Like 2 hours away is definitely close.
Like
It,
if it's more than 5 hours away, then it's not a day trip. But if it's two
right.
hours away, that's just a leave before noon so that you can be there at noon.
I don't think people realize, like, they're like, oh, Americans are always in their car. I'm like, yes, we are. Have you seen our country? Like, it's just, it is sort of like, and it's funny because I'm like, you think, and maybe they do, but I'm like, you think Russians would understand? They're like Russians and Chinese and Indians are like the only people who might. Like, it's just like,
Yeah, but they have trains. Like Russia,
that's
especially
true.
Russians and Chinese now, the Russians for like the last century, they
Lenin and the
they both
train.
have they have trains, but they also don't travel as much
No.
because they have, this is not I'm not trying to make Dugin sound like he knows what he's doing or whatever, but part of that is because their whole society has not been uprooted every half generation. So you don't have to move constantly. You can grow up and live and die in one city or one geographic area and not travel all around Russia. And you can still basically have a, I don't know, a marginally decent life in a way that is in the US for the last 50 years. That's just not been true at all.
You can if you're not from one of the metropoles in Russia where people actually are all concentrated. But I want to
Well, yeah.
push back on that because like Russia's had what three great catastrophes that took out a fourth of its male population over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's
Like
true.
like we don't have that. Like we haven't like you and I haven't been like every dude we know. Half of them are dead by the time we're now. The United States is kind of becoming that way, but
Yeah,
particularly
but in a slow and dragged out way, which is makes it less shocking, but also less impactful.
yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, one of my things against all the collapses that I know, and a lot of them are influenced by the Russian thinker Dmitry Orlov. Maybe we should cover him eventually on this long, like the number of weird reactionaries I want and normal conservatives I want to cover is like I'll do this longer than I do my communist show at this point.
Well, yeah,
But
because I already have a book that I wanted to suggest, maybe
okay.
not for next, but for fairly soon. Um, it's the National Bolshevist Manifesto by Ernst Niekisch.
Yeah, we should do that one, but we should do something more normal first.
Yeah,
Um,
that's fair.
uh, but I do. I I'm very torn. Actually, and this will be how we talk about the show. I started with Dugin. I mean, we talked about this all the time, but I now am in completely think I made the right decision. Actually, because in some ways he is reflective of the smarter reactionary and conservative thinkers that I think about. Like I've talked about them that no one in the no American reads. They always fuck with some fucking Ben Shapiro or
Right.
whatever. And I'm like, no, read Michael Oakenshoot, read Grant, read I mean fuck even read David Frum, even though he's a hack. But like read George Will, um read Maury Rothbard. Like there are scions in this tradition that are not stupid. You avoid them actively.
Well,
Like
Rothbard might be stupid, but he's still worth reading. Also, I had this wrong. I said Ernst Niekisch, but it meant Karl Petel.
okay.
Yeah,
I do think
it's
we're
this
gonna
one.
have to do more with National Bolshevism, and I think we have to do Younger eventually. But I also think the one thing that I see that happens, we also have to do fucking Russell Kirk. We have to. You cannot talk about the American right without talking about the conservative tradition. Like that's the book that forms the Reagan coalition.
So maybe
Like
that should be the next book, even
yeah,
after
I mean
after we finish this one.
yeah,
If
because
we finish this one.
if we finish it, I mean, but it's interesting because I think I, we spend so much time reading, for lack of a better term, French gobbledygook, um, and then like dunking on Ben Shapiro. And look, I don't think all French thinkers like. I actually will defend Badiou and all that too. For people who come
Yeah,
at me,
sure.
I'm just usually on Team Germany as opposed to Team France. But but in a real sense, I also think like we have acted like yes, there aren't that many conservative intellectuals, but we avoid the ones that are good because let's be frank, there aren't that many liberal intellectuals who are articulate about what liberalism is either. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the last liberal intellectual other than Fukuyama that I can even think of is well, I can't think of.
Jonathan Israel, Isaiah Berlin. And
Oh
I
yeah,
think
that's what I was thinking of.
yeah,
Isaiah Berlin.
Isaiah Berlin. And I also think this is another conservative thinker that I like. I like way more than I like Dugin even. Is John Gray. John Gray and John Lukács are like major influences on Barn Thought. John
I have never heard of. I have never read John Gray.
The New Leviathans, Thoughts After Liberalism is back there. That came out this year. I bought it. Seven Types of Atheism. Uh Liberalism and its Discontents. That's another one. Um, John Gray pisses everybody off. He's not really part of the American conservative tradition because like he thinks capitalism is stupid. Like it's but John Gray is a red Tory hyper pessimist liberal, post liberal. Like and he is a pessimist, truly a pessimist. Um And I just find when I read that stuff, or even someone who's a little bit of a hack like Theodore Dalrymple, do you know him?
I not really know.
Okay. See, I have been assuming, Jason, that like most of my audience actually knew the right. And I'm realizing they don't, when they're critiquing their enemies, they don't know what the fuck they're talking about.
Oh yeah, I mean when we
Like,
talk about the right, like
it's your caricature
base.
of your annoying uncle. Like, that's basically
Yeah,
what you're
yeah,
arguing with.
exactly.
Like, it's
I'm
just
trying to think of this. Who's the guy? He was a radio host, or he was like a not a radio host. Doesn't matter. I'll come up with this name that I'll be
Buckley.
really surprised at. That's who I'm exactly. Yes, William Buckley. It's like if you're talking about the American conservative tradition, typically speaking, you're talking to a person who knows Buckley and almost nobody else at all.
Yeah, and Buckley's like their image of a smart conservative, and like I hate to tell them Buckley was a CIA agent. So like, it's you know, I mean, it's interesting because when people tell me Buckley's a smart conservative, I'm like, have you read God and Man at Yale? It's stupid. He's just posh as fuck, and you can't tell the difference.
Well, and
Like,
also because the standard understanding of what a conservative is like George W. Bush seems like a dumb guy, and in comparison, Buckley seems like a smart guy. But like
right?
the world is bigger than those two people, and the real spectrum has both of them on the same end.
Oh yeah, like there's if I'm gonna, I mentioned the Sedgwick books. There's two of them. There's there's Against the Modern World, and there's also one he wrote recently on the current right, which I haven't read yet, but am going to read very soon. But there's another book called Right Wing Critics of American Conservatism that goes through these various dissident traditions, including neo-reaction, but also like the agrarian conservative movement in the South, both the neo-Confederate and non-neo-Confederate version, the different kinds of libertarians that there are and their critiques of American conservatism, the kind of paleo conservative and like loyal opposition, which is like Buchanan, but also uh I mean in some ways like Trump's early cabinet and Steve Bannon,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
they actually do come out of that tradition. Um so it's interesting. And what's also interesting, and I think people don't realize this now, but the Reagan coalition had those people in it. The Bush coalition kicked them out because
Right.
those
That
people were
was
critics of the war.
that was the reason why Trump was initially. I took him, somewhat more seriously than I do now, but that was because of the way that he was bringing certain elements back in for like a few minutes.
Well, I actually maybe this is a good thing to talk about. Like, we're gonna get Dugin come back up again as a booming in now that Trump stands a realistic chance of getting reelected. I don't know how. Like, I've always said, like, you guys are afraid of Project 25, right? But if Project 25 was serious, the Heritage Foundation would not be publicly listing it so that the spies in the military can be prepared for when Trump comes to office. You fucking morons! Like, if they meant
That's
it,
true.
the electorate wouldn't know. Like, um, uh, and maybe Trump means it. I can't tell how delusional. Like, that's a man who has a reptile brain, but also has a real delusional side.
Yeah.
But like, I'm very serious when they're like, oh, Project 2025 is going to destroy American democracy. I'm like, and they're announcing it so that the military can be ready for them. Are they stupid? Like, unless they don't
Well,
mean it,
that's
unless they think this is all a game for their constituency and it's all cynical. Like,
that's the hope, though. The hope is that they're actually stupid.
yeah, I think they do hope that they go that the Heritage Foundation has drank their own Kool-Aid, and undoubtedly some of them have. Like, there's a lot of liberals who have clearly drank their own Kool-Aid. In fact, part of the problem of contemporary progressivism is that a lot of them didn't mean it, and now they kind of do, and now they don't know what like.
Yeah, so now
How
they
do
don't know what to do.
how do I explain this? Like, millennial and Zoomer progressives think that baby boomer progressives meant what they said.
Right.
And I'm just like, why? Why on earth would you think that? Like, um, like in this weird way, the left-wing millennial is actually the victory of the George W. Bush institution mentality.
Yeah.
Because they do trust institutions. Like, they've learned nothing. Like,
Yeah. In
maybe
fact,
they don't now, but like they did until very
mean,
recently. Like,
I think they still kind of do mostly now as well.
I remember listening to these young things like, we shouldn't abolish agencies because that's anti-institutional. I'm like, one, they don't mean it. They don't mean it for a second. That's just a way to like take the radical anarchist rhetoric and like rebuy it into the progressive elements of the party, and then like say, oh, by abolish we mean defund, and by getting rid of ICE we mean moving it back to the NHS. I mean to the not
Right.
the NHS, the ATF.
Oh yeah.
Like like we don't actually mean what it sounds like we mean. But and by Medicare for all we mean single payer, maybe. Sometimes. And you're not actually going to get that. And by the way, we've been defunding Medicare during the entire Biden administration too. But
Yeah.
you know, you can believe that, right? And I also think like one of the interesting things that the GOP in America have is the anti-institutional bias of the GOP. They fucking believe now, and thus you can't run an institution that you also claim to want to destroy. Like,
I mean, maybe you can. We'll find out in Argentina.
they're already getting slapped around by the Chinese in ways that are funny. So,
yeah.
But I mean, like, it is interesting. It's also interesting to me that like Americanism always pops up in a more literal place somewhere else. Like someone didn't send the reactionaries elsewhere the memo that we didn't really mean it. Like it's all, and similarly to like woke ideology, like shit that like never would become law in the United States, like becomes law in Britain under a Tory government. It's bizarre. Like it's just wild. And so I get, and when I describe it in these terms, I'm like, oh, I get how Dugin's attractive. Like, and this is something that Sean and I talked on diving into the wreckage. Like, I don't believe the conservative, like, unlike some of my brothers in the Platypus Affiliated Society, not to call it any names, but I don't believe that the right really means most of what it says, that it doesn't really believe in freedom for shit. Like, freedom of speech was clearly just a cynical move so they can block speech data, like all that stuff.
Yeah.
Clear. And I've seen the cycles of it enough to like, because remember we talked about freedom of speech in the 90s, and then like the Patriot Act fucking happened. Like, come on. And I do remember when at least the Alex Joneses of the world had the balls to call that out and oppose their own block, which they do not anymore. I mean, that's the irony.
Really since 2016.
Yeah, the irony of both Trump and Obama Sanders, which I actually see as a related phenomenon, is that the dissident movements are brought into the fold and neutralized over and over again.
Yeah, definitely.
And I wonder on the world stage if that's not something of why like fourth political theory isn't really a threat, right? Because like it's going to be brought in and neutralized to the world systems, which are larger than this ideology and have logics that go beyond even liberalism. And I think that's where like Dugin can't go. That's gonna be one of my critiques. Like Dugin can't go to like some of these logics are about something beyond just what you fucking believe. Like, and that is a far scarier world for everybody. And I think it's scary for Marxists because Marxists like half believe it, but then we kind of don't. Like we're always like blah blah blah, developmental forces, periods and epochs, blah blah blah, blah blah blah, and then like, but we can have a revolution if we just like demand the impossible. And I'm like, no, that's not how this works. Like you can't believe both.
That's
things.
not how anything works.
Like you have to slowly build the conditions that reinforce what you want and the incentive structures that reinforce what you want. And it takes time and it's revolutionary because it's literally taking something you're taking from an embryonic stage and imposing it through an act of abolition of something else. Like, but you have to build that. You can't just believe it. Who gives a shit if you believe it? Like, I believe a lot of stuff. Like, it's not necessarily relevant.
And on the other hand, you can participate in it even if you don't believe in it.
Oh yeah, well, it's one of the things I think that communists have historically fucked up about is we've like cared what people thought too much.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm
like
serious
way
about
too.
that. Like we got you got to believe no. Like we don't like you and I both were like, well, the Bolsheviks screwed up with the faction ban because it like people are going to disagree and don't tell me there weren't factions in the Soviet Union. There was just like we just denied it and got rid of the other ones, which increased the stakes to more zero sum and made people more killy. Like
Yeah,
that's
and
what it
all,
does.
and it undermined the Soviet Union as a result.
Right. But I also like, and I agree with that, but I also like, but what are the weird, like, this is where I have some sympathy to the Marxist Leninist defenses because I'm like, but given the stupid situation they found themselves in, what could they have done? Now, the scary conclusion to that is they couldn't have done much, which means the revolution was doomed.
Hmm.
End of discussion. And, like that, and thus we should have also a very like, almost seemingly contradictory attitude. Like people wonder about my attitude towards China, which I am highly fucking critical of because I think they're going to just become a bourgeois force if they're not careful. I see plenty of evidence for it. Um, and that they are, and that they don't believe, like China has not tried to reinstitute any real spirit of internationalism in any way, and thus it really can't do what it wants to do, even when it tries to undermine the Western order. Because ironically, it needs the West participation in that for it to happen without disastrous consequences to itself.
Right. I mean,
And
so I wouldn't. I think for now, I'll accept the end of discussion when it comes to ML defenses and what could they have done instead. Because I feel like I might be able to respond to that, but like in a different setting and at a different time. I feel like I want to say more about that.
well, I think it's something we should discuss one day as a separate show. Like, what
Yeah,
do we think? Like, I think counterfactuals are somewhat useless now, but if we're going to posit counterfactuals, whether the counterfactuals that make, let's say, Stalin even becomes the head of the Soviet Union, but you don't have the purges and whatever else. Because I actually have been convinced that is not just Stalin's fault remotely. Like that is
oh
not
yeah,
just
definitely not.
bad dude bad. Like that's not what's going on there. And um, like when you look at that, where do you go? And like my other thing is like, I come for people who don't know, I kind of come from left communist adjacent traditions. Like I'm not even a trot, I'm further left than that historically. But I got very frustrated with those traditions because like there seems to be just a tacit denial of fucking reality a lot of the time. It's just like we're gonna
Because
build
they can't really maintain themselves otherwise.
right. There's like this idea that we have to build every left institution from scratch completely anew because of the problems inherent in those institutions. But then they have no way to do it except for like tiny sectarian organizations which can at best do entryism. Like that's which ends up being the same thing the Trots ended up getting stuck in a strange way, except we're
Yeah,
even more sectarian than Trotskyists were.
which
Like
which takes a lot.
it's hard. It's real hard.
Yeah,
Like it's active effort. Um, and ironically, one of the interesting things about a lot of left communists is they both do and don't believe that ideology matters. And sometimes they'll just claim it, and then other times they're like, "But Stalin and the Soviet Union, and they killed the workers thing, and like, the Soviet Union falling actually should have been a liberatory to the world revolution." And I'm just like, you might have been able to say that in 1992. You cannot say that now with a straight face.
yeah, and
Like,
honestly, even by 94, 95, you shouldn't have been able to say that. You
yeah,
shouldn't have said that anymore, and certainly by now.
because to tie this up into Dugin, so people actually know that we're ranting, but that actually is tied in. Dugin is part of the end result of this process.
Well, so is Putin. So like back in the
Right.
Yeltsin years, you could say, well, look at how insane Russia is, and obviously that's not going to last. And that means that the collapse of the Soviet Union could be good because of the way that it's going to, you know, give rise to a new workers movement or whatever. But ever since '99, when Putin was on the ascendancy, That's the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right
Yeah.
now is the result of the collapse of the USSR.
Which ironically does mean that there's certain MLs who believe more in the collapse of the USSR than we do. Ironically, who actually inadvertently, without realizing it, have adopted a left communist position in their defense of Deng and of Mao. Uh, I love pointing that out. But they're like, because
Yeah,
like,
you know who was awesome was Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis.
yeah, and you know who else was awesome? Deng. But you know who was a dirty revisionist? Khrushchev. Why? Because
Yeah,
fucking reasons. Shut up. Like it's just it's
exactly. Yeah.
and you know who was awful? Bukharin. But you know who was awesome? Bukharin. Like it's you know, because both Deng and Gorby praised Bukharin, but we got it. But Bukharin being dead, it's like you guys are you've lost your own plot, right? And I think, and if you think our Reds are discombobulated, I can't imagine what Russian post-communists were like in the late 1990s, early aughts. I imagine, like, I really don't have a frame of reference for it. I haven't seen that stuff translated because it must be insane. Like, it's just got to be very
Well, I
bizarre.
mean, there's a reason why the National Bolshevik Party exists. You know,
Right.
as not a German phenomenon, but as a Russian phenomenon. It's only possible because of the insane confusion of the 90s.
Which, in some ways, is why also the National Bolshevik movement could exist in the insane confusion after the German Revolution failed in 1918.
Yeah, exactly. For
Right.
the exact same reasons, even.
Yeah, and why even though I also point out there is like that soil for that in Germany, in the German historical school and armchair socialism, etc., was actually, we don't study it. We like pretend it didn't exist, or you like when people go,
Yeah.
well, Marx was critiquing socialists. I'm like, he was critiquing Louis Blanc, and he was critiquing those weird German National Socialist people who were not Nazis yet because they didn't exist yet, but were like the German historical school generation who led up to and included the Marxian version of that, which is Werner Sombart, like who
Well,
end up
yeah,
being Nazis. Like, like
like if you look at like Ferdinand Lassalle or Eugene Düring or any of the other major figures that Marx and Engels were contending with at the time, that those were the National Socialists of their day.
right. And Spengler talks about them, the Prussian socialism, and then like there's also all the theorists behind that, which are like the predecessors to modern monetary theory. And stuff like that. Like uh that's we're gonna I think one of the things that I think is interesting about Dugin, as my final thought on this, that points out how insane this has all gotten and why he might be appealing today to a certain kind of Marxist and to a lot of reactionaries, um, is that although interestingly, I don't think the average American conservatism would have the intellectual framework, even if they were serious intellectuals, to totally approach him in a way that a Marxist actually would, which is an
Right.
interesting problem. Like, um, unless you're one of those weirdo conservatives who really knows the European new right, which means, I don't know, you're Richard Spencer or something, like you don't really have a framework to even comprehend this for the most part. But which is part of why I think like like Dugin's aimed at the United States, and I also think he's like weirdly was kind of aimed at Marxists and then gave that up and try to wish out into the Trumpist Alex Jones world, and that didn't really work. And interestingly, he's come back to Marxist, and this time it kind of stuck. Is because like I do think if you're an intellectual like Mark Millerman and you studied Heidegger and then you became a Marxist and you got fed up with all that theory and maybe you can't go full Gabriel Lockhill or whatever, like this speaks to you because
Yeah, definitely.
you see where this comes out of. But the other thing that I see is like right now, every form of left-wing intellectual life involves a primary contradiction that cannot acknowledge itself. Like, okay, what does the Bernie Sanders movement want? All right. It wants a détente between socialism and modern monetary theory. It wants
Yeah.
a welfare state without imperialism, kind of. It wants it. Now, this is not true of Bernie himself, but it is true of Bernie supporters. It wants it without nationalism, but somehow nationally organized and methodologically nationalist at every level. Everything's nationalized, not socialized, etc.
Right.
Let's look at the MMT. Like, what it leads to other weird stuff. Where did Graeber ultimately end up? MMT. There are anarchists who believe in a transitional form to anarchism that is basically the state form of controlling society through money, and whose primary historical organizations are Mesopotamian warlord kings and British imperialism.
Yeah, but for good instead of for bad, though. You know,
Yeah, I mean, basically, like
that's the
that's
difference.
the argument. Like, and someone like Graeber unironically arrives there. How do you do that as an anarchist? Like, and yet it's super common. It is. You know how many, now MMT Stalinist, I actually kind of get. See,
Well, sure, yeah,
mentioned
makes a lot more
national
sense.
Bolsheviks, right? But,
Right.
like, um, like, black political thought, and I don't just mean like superficial, like Kamala Harris Democratic, but like Cedric Robinson level, like
Like
critiques,
actual black political thought. Yeah.
yeah, like critiques of a black Marxism for not weirdly at both, our Afro pessimism is another serious form of this, right? Weirdly it both like reifies the right power structure and race in a way that becomes untranscendable. Like, and essentially it both claims not just strategic essentialization, which is like pretending things are essential so that you can get ahead, a la, high caste Indian post-colonial theory.
Right.
But also like actual, like Marxism is great, but it'll never work for African Cedric Robertson.
Right.
Like there's no way to have an African approach to that. Our decolonialism, we have to reject Marxism because it's too Eurocentric. Blah blah blah. Like,
Yeah, and like Julius Nyerere or whatever in Tanzania,
yeah,
he was actually just Eurocentric.
yeah. It's just it's bizarre. So, and I remember like Samir Amin when he was still alive in the 90s arguing with these people. But I bring this up because we are like I can call out all the seeming contradictions in Duginism. But I want to call out that one of the reasons why this stuff flies this stuff isn't caught to many people who find this appealing is because our own thinking is rife with these kind of transparent contradictions. Just obvious if you state them plainly. And we don't. And we don't on purpose, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say we don't state them plainly because it would be obvious.
Right. I mean, like the moment you state this stuff plainly, it becomes obvious how bankrupt and contradictory and impossible it all is. And so I guess, my final thought is like that inclines me not to read Dugin as a friend. I do not think he is our friend. I want people to understand that before people start going off about how Jason and Varn have gone completely red brown. I mean, I'm sure that's going to happen eventually. Most of the comments on this show have actually been good, even from conservatives. The biggest critique is that we mumble. Yeah, fuck them. I'm not mumbling. It's true. So whatever.
The people that are going to call us red brown have already been calling us red brown anyways.
So. Yeah, it's actually some people who used to call me red brown now don't because of the series, which is kind of refreshing. But yes, there are people who have called me red brown and have called you red brown just for knowing me, which is kind of funny, considering how much red brown people seem to hate me these days. Which is fine. I don't really like. I'm not really worried about like patriotic socialists being mad at me. But
there's just not that many. There aren't enough of them to care that much.
I mean, like it can make my Twitter slightly unpleasant, but I left that, so they're no longer a concern of mine. So but in all seriousness, I do think that does lead me to say, like, we should read Dugin charitably. We should point this out, but like, I'm also pointing out how much of this is in our own house. Because if we're gonna throw this shit at Duginist, we better clean up our own act, because they're gonna throw this shit right back at us, and we generally do not have a response. And that makes them look good, because a
Yeah.
lot of them actually do know the history. Even if they know it in this weird way. Like, so, I'm not saying that like the average internet Twitter, you know, mecha communist or patriotic social, whatever they're fucking calling themselves today, or whichever section of what's calling themselves, whatever, is this smart. But I'm saying that like a lot of the responses I see to them by people who've read this have been totally insufficient, because
Hmm.
they basically straw man the argument. They're like, well, Dugin's just a fascist. And I'm like, he's a post-fascist. We have to deal with that. He actually he thinks racism is really, really bad. And I think he means that sincerely. Um, Although he defines racism differently than most of us would.
Yeah,
You
but
know,
it doesn't matter if you feel like that's inadequate. It matters if you can respond to it in a way which is convincing, not just in a way which makes you feel good.
right. It's like, who are you trying to convince? Are you trying to convince a neutral party who reads this and thinks it is intelligent that we have a response to it? Or are you trying to convince yourself that this is silly and we don't even have to deal with it?
Yeah,
And
I mean it's definitely the latter.
right. And while I do think the irony of turning Dugin into like Putin's Rasputin is it weirdly makes him safer, by overpowering him in a way that's clearly not true. Um, I'm not saying there's nothing to it. I do sort of think like, well, why did they blow up his daughter if he wasn't they had no political influence? But I've never really figured that out. Um,
Yeah, but there's probably something there. Yeah, I just feel like it's overblown.
no, it's definitely overblown. And every person, every even expat or Russian I know has told me like Dugin's not that important in the country. The people I know who seem to think Dugin is actually really serious, a lot of them come out of like Islamicist adjacent areas in Europe. Are there like expatriates? And I will tell you, I know for a fact that some of these groups have targeted expatriates, like expatriates leftists who are frustrated with imperialism. Like, I know they have.
Right.
Like, so I do think like they're probably, for people who want to say Dugin has no influence, I don't think it's true. But I don't think he's a boogeyman. Um, and particularly, I think when we get into this Heidegger chapter, we're gonna have to deal with the fact like if if you are used to reading left theory from the 90s and aughts, this is gonna read like that but smarter. And that, like, I want you to take this second chapter by Dugin and the average chapter by Zizek from the same time period and put it back to back together and tell
Hmm.
me who actually understands post-structuralist thought. And I think it's going to be uncomfortable making.
It's
Like,
probably good that it's going to be uncomfortable, though.
yeah, I mean, like, I would challenge people to do that because I have. Um, and I'm not saying that Zizek doesn't understand it, but like, it's definitely, even though Zizek's more readable, what Dugan's saying is more comprehensible and more comprehensible where I do like oftentimes when when I'm listening to Zizek like explain Lacan, I'm like, well, I know what Zizek thinks.
Right.
Like like uh I actually do think I learned a little bit about even what Deleuze and Guattari thought from this book, particularly this coming up chapter.
Yeah.
And
I think
that
I think
kind of
that Dugin is more comprehensive. Zizek might be more comprehensible,
Mhm.
but Dugin is way more comprehensive, which makes Dugin seem more practical.
Absolutely. And also like more authoritative. And not just
Yeah.
in that like there is the whole like way that conspiracy theorists and whatnot will like throw 85,000 things at you at once that you can't possibly check it all, and some of it seems legit and some of it doesn't, but since you're overwhelmed you just like shut down. I
Yeah.
don't think that's what Dugan's doing. And
No,
that
not that's not the impression I get anyways.
no, when I read it the first time, I was gonna I thought he might be doing that because I have read a lot of like European New Right that does that kind of thing. Like you're just bombarded with concepts and theories from all over the place, like perennialism, post-Marxism, like boom, 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 and you can't like make heads. I didn't feel disoriented like that in this book at all, even though he does mention like stuff I don't know, particularly from like the Aughts Russian Academy, right? But that's because this audience was originally Russian. I think like it was written in Russian.
Yeah, yeah.
Like so,
I
it's
mean, that's to be expected.
yeah.
It's
I mean,
it's
yeah. Go ahead.
it's only overwhelming in the way that you're describing whenever it's an American or a person who speaks English who's making references to stuff that's happening adjacent to your own experience, and then they just overload you with stories about it. But in this case, it seems very patient. It seems very to the point. It seems very backed up. And then whatever's unfamiliar, of course, it's going to be unfamiliar. I would
And
expect it to be unfamiliar.
I mean, I'm actually going to give him credit that he can go over stuff that I've read whole books about in like 2 paragraphs and not say anything that I think is just false, which is hard to do. Like I'm going to call some academics out. I like Rindy Brown, right? But I've read some Rindy Brown where she like name drops, and I'm like, I don't think you're interpreting that correctly. But I just got 40 pages where you just assume this meant this one thing, and I don't know that it does, and you never justified it or cited your source, so I can't really check. Right? Like, and I like that's a theorist that I like.
Hmm.
Like, um, I have found this both in the Marxist and non-Marxist political left that people get away with referencing shit without citing it and saying this means this without actually going into it. And Dugin does some of that too. I mean, he gets on these weird tirades about liberalism does X and Y. But there's a lot of times where he's citing the stuff and explaining what it means and he's fairly accurate. Where we don't bother. Like for
Yeah.
people who, I guess my last bit of meta commentary at the end here. For people who wonder why I read so much of this, this is why, and I go slow because I'm really tired of people asserting so and so says X because they're glossing Marx, Hegel, Lenin, whatever, leaving out the stuff that they don't understand or it's inconvenient for them, and then telling you that their interpretation is definitive without citing it and backing it up. And like that to me, that's not just bad scholarship. That's bad argumentation. I don't do that when I'm like arguing in non-academic sections either. Like I have to like even when you're like say you're arguing with your partner, you have to give examples and back up what you fucking mean.
I mean, you should
And
have to anyway.
yeah. Like an assertion is not an argument. And I find that a lot of younger people, both millennial and Zoomers, actually don't understand that. And when I read the political books they read, I get why. How many
Hmm.
times have you read neoliberalism is X without any like sound definition, historical reference, or whatever? It's just asserted and ran with.
Well, yeah, like I've said this in a bunch of different settings, but the latest Traverso book, The Revolution in Intellectual History, is probably like the single overall and all around best, most prescient and also valuable and also best researched book that I have read from a socialist perspective in like 15 years, unless it was a book from like 1884.
Oh yeah, I'm like I was actually somewhat sympathetic, even though I think somewhat this avoids the question to Cosmonaut's answer that like bourgeois historians have written the best books on Marxism lately because they're just interested in portraying things as they are. Like, look, I do sometimes feel like I learn more about Stalinism from reading Kotkin than I have from reading
Yeah.
pro and anti-Stalin arguments for the past fucking 20 years. Like, um, I also think you can take that too far and ignore that some of these ideological historiographic questions are actually really fucking important. But like, it is
Yeah,
sad
it's
to
just
me,
they're just not the only questions.
right? But it is sad to me that like you got like Traverso. Who else is doing good stuff in this terrain right now? There's a reason why on our other show, I, and Chris always go to fucking historians of the medieval age, which just happen to be Marxist, so that we can talk about stuff. Like, part of that's because of the nature of that show, but part of that's also because they're better writers and they're clear about what they mean. Like,
Yeah, and they
it's
say enough about what they're saying to actually like make it sink in and make it be more than just sound bites.
right. Whereas, like, I know I'm picking on Zizek, and like Zizek's one of the more comprehensible ones, but I've read every Zizek book. I don't know that I understand what Zizek thinks at all. Like, and I've read every single fucking book. Like, I don't even know if he's a communist or not, and I mean that sincerely. Like,
I mean, I know that he says he's a communist, but then I know
sometimes,
but I have also in his book about the pandemic, he makes a case for communism, which he defines explicitly as not communism. So I don't know that he is actually, even whenever he thinks he is one, I don't know if he is one. But anyways, it's what is it?
yeah,
Oh shit, it's like 10, it's almost 10:30. Okay.
it's
Well,
10:30 where you're at. It's like 9:30 where I'm at, and so on that note, on this incredibly long episode, because without Sean. And Sean is coming back, peeps. Without Sean, there's nothing to constrain Jason and Varn.
yeah,
Like,
apparently we'll just go for forever.
Like, without Sean or Chris to go like, hey guys, like, stay on topic. We don't. So
Yeah, because what do we spend 3 hours on half of one chapter?
admittedly though, 2 of those hours is actually fully on topic.
Oh yeah, totally.
So, and the last hour is me talking about whatever this brought up, like bubbling up from my space as we talked about it. So like, which I think is a valid methodology, god damn it, but other people don't, because they have the attention span God gave a 3-year-old, and I've been reading study after study that now I have to make my videos 3 minutes or less to be comprehensible to people who are younger than 35, and I'm just like, well, I guess the future's doomed then, because like I can't do that. I don't know how to condense. Like, people like, if you understand it, you make it short, and I'm like, there's no way for me to sum up like these kinds of ideas in 3 minutes meaningfully. Like,
I mean, like this Dugin book is a summary of, I don't know, 37 or 50 other thinkers' thought, and
right.
also not just summary, but also a synthesis and a sublation of all of the thought. So in order to read it critically, we have to read it slowly, and also we have to explain it as we go. And it's more than just explaining Dugin; it's also explaining what he's saying about Heidegger and what he's saying about, these other 50 people.
Which
It's just
also
going to be,
probably
it's just going to
means
take a while.
explaining Heidegger. I did take what 20 minutes to try to explain what I understand event and being to be in Heidegger. Like, which,
Well, and just wait till chapter 2,
oh,
the
there's
next
so much
chapter.
Heidegger. There's so
Yeah.
much Heidegger, and there's so much Wallerstein. And I actually forgotten that there was that much Wallerstein in chapter 2. I was like, holy shit, there's a ton of Emmanuel Wallerstein in this book. Um, uh, it it's funny. And on that note, we're going to end the show. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed our long dive into what has amounted to 4 hours on. I literally could have read the book out loud and been taking half the time as we've currently taken for the 2 chapters that we've done. But whatever. Hopefully you get a lot out of it.
And if you
And
don't, just, you know, you,
read the
I
book.
won't know anyways.
Yeah, or don't
Yeah.
watch it. I don't care. Like,
Yeah.
I don't monetize my YouTube, so I don't really care about YouTube views. So clearly, I clearly do not care. So, and on that note, have a great evening.